board needs to be huge, and slimming down should help with cost. But the important thing is that it can hit the objectives without running wildly inefficient or having an overheating VRM. Nearly the entire back of the board is covered by a metal backplate that sinks heat via some thermal pads. This can help, it depends on the board. In our experience, it's less helpful than a GPU backplate is because the motherboard's backplate is sandwiched against the case and it has less ability for heat to be effectively removed from the system. A GPU backplate has more exposure to front case fans, so there's some more wicking potential there. Power delivery is handled by an 18 plus 3 plus 3 phase design, which ASRock says is using 110 amp phases. It's technically compatible with dual power supplies in the same way that every board is technically compatible with them, by using an adapter cable that just wires up the signaling pins used to tell the second power supply when to turn on and off. ASRock also says that this lowers the risk of fire. Great. Good. There's no second 24-pin connector on the board. That helps with size for sure. It might help a little bit with cost, but it does mean a messier implementation. The memory layout is the same. It's 1 DIMM per channel setup, as we saw on the Asus board. ASRock specifically claims up to DDR5 7600 support in its spec page. One of the biggest points to an HEDT platform, though, is the much greater I/O capability as compared to regular desktops. That's reflected here. The board is equipped with 5 physical by 16 PCIe slots, with 3 of them on Gen 5 and 2 on Gen 4. The Gen 5 slots are wired to run slots 1 and 3 at by 16, with slot 4 listed as by 8 in ASRock's spec table. Slots 2 and 5 are Gen 4, supporting by 4 and by 8 modes. Storage up next. First off, it's handled by 2 M.2 slots, but one of them is blazing, and the other one is hyper. Naturally, blazing is higher up in the hierarchy than hyper. This is obvious, of course. It's almost as obvious as numbers. Too bad we don't have any for PCIe generations. Ultra probably falls somewhere within this hierarchy, but really it's blazing that matters, we think. The names keep changing. It also has 4 SATA, 2 Slim SAS, and 1 MCIO. We had to look up what that last one is, and we're glad we did because MCIO apparently stands for Mini Cool Edge I/O. And no, we're not joking, that is the name. It's another form factor designed to transmit PCIe signals over a cable, somewhat similar to Oculink or U.3, but the connector design should be capable of PCIe 6.0 once it arrives. Rear I/O is made up of 6 USB Type-A ports, 4 at 10 gigabit and 2 at 5 gigabit. There are 2 Type-C ports, 1 at 20 and 1 at 10 gigabits per second, 2 LAN ports, 1 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit, Wi-Fi 6E, and some basic audio connectivity. It doesn't seem like USB 4 is anywhere on this one, not even internally, and it's not listed in their spec sheet. ASRock also has the WRX90WS Evo, which sounds like a Subaru. The ASRock press release shows off a little bit of its WRX90WS Evo motherboard for Pro CPUs, but there's no dedicated product page at the time of writing. We do have one low-res photo to work with, though. It's clearly a larger board with 8 DIMM slots for the Threadripper Pro CPU's 8 memory channels and an additional VRM cooling fan on the right side, totaling 5. There's also 7 physically full-length PCIe by 16 slots, but we're not sure of the electrical wiring. LAN is upgraded too, with dual 10 gigabit and an additional dedicated management port. The board also appears to be wider. Gigabyte is up next. So far, they have only announced 1 board for Threadripper 7000, at least at the time of filming this. They'll probably have more, but let's take a look at the one they have announced. This one is the Gigabyte TRX50 Aero D. It's definitely the most aesthetically focused so far, with a silvery bare aluminum look across all of the heat sinks and the rear I/O cover. It's not clear from the photos we have today whether there are any built-in heatsink fans, but it doesn't look like it. There aren't any perforations in the I/O cover either to suggest if one might be hiding there. The board's spec page claims a 16 plus 8 plus 4 phase VRM, and if it turns out that there aren't going to be any fans included with this board for the VRM heatsink, then fans mounted on the top of the case would help with cooling it. It's not as fully finned though as it probably should be. Instead, Gigabyte is relying on larger blocks of aluminum. The thermal tab for the board states presence of an 8mm heat pipe through the VRM heatsink though, to help move some of the heat around. Compared to the other boards, the Aero D has less PCIe connectivity for the boards we're looking at today. It's cut down to only 3 full-length slots. That said, Gigabyte is really proud of its PCIe UD slot X. boasting 10x strength for graphics card. Fantastic. We'll need that when the RTX 5090 Cinder Block Edition comes out. The Aero D has a lot of M.2 slots, totaling 4, and contributing to the general feeling that this is the most desktop-aligned Threadripper 7000 board we've seen so far. Backing that up is the fact that it doesn't look like it has any enterprise-grade storage connectivity in the likes of Slim SAS, U.3, or MCIO, or at least none that were listed on the product page at the time of writing. It does, however, appear to have 8 SATA ports on the right edge. Rear I/O includes both 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. There's also Wi-Fi 7, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and 2 USB 4 Type-C ports. This, plus the M.2 support, position the board in an interesting place where it could be the best option for a user who needs to regularly transfer large files onto and off of external storage. An example might be a dedicated video transcode station or something, where the user needs to dump the footage onto the system, transcode it, move it to another editing station. Of course, there's more boards coming out that we haven't seen yet, so maybe this will kind of evolve. One last curious addition to the rear I/O is a DisplayPort in. The most immediately useful case we could think of would be if the user wants to run the USB 4 right below it as a display output for monitors that require a Type-C input. This is done by running a DisplayPort cable between the discrete GPU and the motherboard. Gigabyte hasn't published a manual at the time of writing, so we're not able to confirm that this is the intended purpose, but it's our best speculation right now. Finally, we have Supermicro with the H13SRA-TF. It's by far the board with the most alphanumerically complex name, and that makes it better. But unironically, it's the most function-focused Threadripper board that we've looked at so far, and in typical Supermicro fashion, they are completely focused on that functionality. The aesthetics are secondary. If you haven't heard of Supermicro, perhaps you are mostly a sort of desktop gaming type system builder, but Supermicro is prevalent in server and in high-end builds where you might want that extra functionality, IPMI, stuff like that. It's also notable for being the smallest board that's been announced at true ATX size. Since this is built to be more of a serious work motherboard, it features dedicated LAN for IPMI, dual 10 gigabit LAN, 1 COM port, and a VGA port. And yes, those are still useful. In fact, we actually still use VGA ports for our server system. For storage, it's got 4 SATA. PCIe is listed as 2 PCIe 5.0 by 8 with the slot cut, 2 PCIe 5.0 by 16, 1 PCIe 4.0 by 8, and MCIO connector. This board would be particularly useful in a server solution, something like the first one that we built with Wendell, actually the second one as well, where being able to remote into the server and monitor all the sensors, not necessarily just within Linux, but through its own interface, that's a huge feature and a great value add. It's useful for home servers, just as it is for sort of a small business type server, which is what we're using. So that's something that makes these types of boards particularly interesting, and the smaller form factor is of course beneficial as well for case compatibility. So that's it for the overview. We're not sure how many of these we'll be looking at with the Threadripper launch. Typically we try to run our CPU reviews on Asus boards just because we have a good understanding of the BIOS and where we can lock stuff down to keep like for like testing. So we'll probably be trying to test on one of those boards for launch at least. It's likely we'll work on getting a Gigabyte one. Hopefully MSI comes to the party. If they do, we'll take a look at one of those. But either way, the options we've covered here have enough differences between them where users who have a specific idea or concept for a Threadripper build probably already know which one they're pointed towards. Things like I/O, one of the key differentiating factors here. And if you need assistance in trying to figure out which board to buy, first of all, wait for them to launch so that people can use them and talk about them. But secondly, probably the number one thing you're looking at, other than does it clear the basis for a decent VRM, is going to be the I/O support, and specifically what you need for your build, and features like IPMI, if that's important to you. But there aren't a lot of boards, and they're all going to be relatively expensive. It is exciting, though, to have this type of product back on the market, because HEDT was kind of dead for a couple years. Pricing, of course, is a lot different from what it was in the first generation of Threadripper and the second generation of Threadripper, although it's maybe closer to the Threadripper 5000 Pro stuff. So pricing's higher than it used to be, but in the very least, it's nice to have that enthusiast market kind of coming back and giving some more options. And we're excited to work with it because for our use cases as a business, a lot of times we can make use of those extra I/O and PCIe lane capabilities. Okay, so that's gonna be it for this one. We will be working on reviews for Threadripper. As soon as we have it in, we'll have them public, hopefully around or just before the launch of the product. Hopefully, we'll see. And as always, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly, like by grabbing one of our brand new GN15 emblem pint glasses, or you can go to gamersaccess.net if you just want to check out the website and see the written version of content. This will be ported over there in written format in not too long. So, thanks for watching. See you all next time.
Ini baju mengodi.
Holy shit, it's at 35 amps. Oh, it's on fire. Yeah, I can smell it.
Jesus Christ, 200 Celsius.
Holy shit. That's that's not supposed to be like that.
There's also a level of possible fuckery here that you should be aware of.
These CPUs self-destructed. Literally, they internally combusted to such a degree that the inside of them blasted outward. When we conducted internal failure analysis, we saw scorch marks in the same spot on 3 dead CPUs, the center of the IO die and the edge of the CCD, and that immediately pointed us to the root cause. Also, we saw fractured silicon. Although AMD released a statement about lowering SoC voltage, we still need to understand exactly what happened. These companies bottle up details forever when they find the actual root cause, and in our testing there's more to it than simply the SoC voltage at the surface level. It's not just death over time then from VSoC. We found improper fail-safe protections on ASUS and useless OCP on ASUS. We also found bugs on therm trips between a couple of boards. We found a BIOS so buggy with Gigabyte that it can kill chips accidentally.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Wow, okay. What the hell? Something's wrong. Yeah, maybe their SoC knob is broken. And we found borderline adversarial communication between AMD and its partners, which is a different issue entirely. We're sending one of these out to the same failure analysis lab that worked on the NVIDIA 12-volt high power cables for us, but that content will be in a few weeks. Today, though, we soldered leads to rails that we suspected were running voltage too high. We employed thermography to prove that, yes, explosions are hot. We used an external voltage controller to read the VRM configuration and ran testing on the BIOS revisions that ASUS silently snapped out of existence. Oh, and we also killed 2 of our 7800X3Ds and 2 motherboards. So it's been expensive, but it's in the name of science. This video is brought to you by us and our special limited edition 15-year anniversary GN foil shirt on store.gamersnexus.net. I started the Gamers Nexus website in May of 2008, and within the next few months of 2023, we're going to hit 2 million subscribers. To commemorate this, we're launching this shirt on pre-sale right now. It features a vibrant, brilliant blue component diagram GN logo, complete with PCIe slots, GPUs, fans, and more modeled in. We also used a gold foil 15 integrated with this special variation of the GN logo. The back of the shirt uses gold foil to show our trend line from when we were only a website until today. There will be a total of 5 special GN15 items launching over the course of the next year or so to commemorate 15 years in operation, all of which are limited and collectible within their different categories. This shirt directly funds massive testing efforts like this video and helps us to continue investing money and time into public service testing and analysis. And you get something unique, shiny, and brilliant, just like exploding CPUs. Back order one on store.gamersnexus.net today. All this started going down right as we arrived at AMD's headquarters for a totally unrelated video, so that was convenient for us. And AMD was in the middle of its scramble trying to diagnose it, so they were just as fresh working on this as us. Maybe a little bit of lead time, but this is all a very new issue. So as soon as we got back, I set forth to working on some specific aspects of diagnosis and asked Patrick on our team to assist me tackling the rest. And here's a quick recap of what's going on. Although there's evidence of this happening prior, the biggest post was on April 20th of 2023 when user SpeedRookie posted this harrowing set of images on Reddit showing a CPU and a motherboard. We reached out to the user and requested the fastest shipping under $500, and then we paid the user for their board, their CPU, and the shipping. And this arrangement, by the way, we are always open to if you have some kind of catastrophic failure of a part. It allows you to skip the RMA process. It allows us to research it and have a public demonstration of what happened rather than the company going, oopsie, here's a new one. Let's find a rug to put that under. And it moves you along quickly. So this allowed SpeedRookie to move forward, and we got our content. A trend of other users, with Asus boards especially and dead CPUs, popped up on Reddit. But since then, other users have posted in a mega thread about similar issues, including one from user SkyfishJY. This one was of a Gigabyte board and a 7800X3D as well. The user didn't apply Expo and used only factory settings. In the photos, the user's board looked okay, but the CPU was clearly bulged once again. We bought these components from Skyfish as well and got the expedited shipping so we could add it to this video. So this setup behind me is what we use for testing. We have 2 camera setup plus a thermal camera. We added a camera this time from the 12-volt high power stuff because last time we were like, wow, that footage is some good meme material for ever. It's currently at 258 degrees.
I think we see the smoke, Steve.
You see the smoke? There's no cause for panic immediately. So if you have an X3D CPU, even if you have it in an Asus board, you don't need to freak out right now. We do have some steps at the end of the video. We're gonna explain why it's all happening, but this isn't so widespread that everyone's CPU is going to fail. Just like the 12-volt high power stuff, there tends to be a lot of chaos and panic as soon as the first couple of these get posted, and you don't need to panic completely. Only some of you will have this happen. Does that help? But we think most of these are related to an SoC voltage that's too high, causing a slow death of the CPU. This is something that's known at this point and well documented. Future Steve here, however, we also discovered that Asus has a major fuck up on its overcurrent protection, where its super fancy $700 ultra premium motherboards are designed in such a way that there are insufficient protection mechanisms where overcurrent protection allows for the CPU to be fast cooked from underneath after the CPU is separately slow cooked from within. So it's a combination of failures here, but the catastrophic part of this is one that Asus can completely avoid, which we're gonna talk about a little bit later. It's possible this happens on motherboards outside of Asus too. We can't possibly test them all, but Asus was the easy one to figure out. And it took 4 days of nonstop testing, so. Let's start with filtering what we know and some plans. So first, as we entered this testing, we kept an open mind to the variables presented by motherboard vendors, AMD, BIOS versions, and users alike. We noticed some of the failed parts online didn't exhibit the same mutual destruction between the board and the CPU. That indicated to us that there are actually two problems rolled into one. One is the CPU is dying, and the other is that some motherboards then proceed to self-immolate and barbecue the CPU even further because a protection mechanism probably failed.
That's not good.
So if we clear CMOS.
You killed it the wrong way.
Based on the data we're presenting today then, we believe this to be one part AMD's fault and one part board vendor's fault. We're gonna get into the hypothesis and some of the physical inspection first. Again, we have a separate video. It's coming out in a few weeks. This stuff, it's not quick to do. We're trying to move as fast as we can because the internet moves fast, and this particular failure analysis we're doing separately is going to require external lab investigation, and that's gonna take some time. But for the first part, here's our hypothesis. We have three sets of components we're working on. We have a dead CPU and a catastrophically failed motherboard from SpeedRookie. We have a dead CPU and actually a still fully functional Gigabyte board from Skyfish. That one failed properly. And we have a was working but died for the cause GN CPU, and the motherboard still works. Actually make that 4 sets of parts, not 3. While filming this video, we decided one more try and YOLO'd another $650 on a 7800 X3D, another $700 on a motherboard, and we managed to kill $1,300 worth of parts. And that is all the more reason you should go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of these shirts, because it would help us out with funding these types of videos. We also have a promo where if you spend $65 or more, you get an additional discount, and that's at the top of the store page at store.gamersnexus.net. Using the full CPU pinout and schematic from a friend of ours, it's a lengthy document, we're able to use these images of the pinout to figure out what we care about on these CPUs. At this point, Patrick and I split them up and we started doing some resistance checking. We found low resistance shorts on the CPU that failed catastrophically and torched the motherboard. But we found 0 ohm complete shorts for the CPU we killed, which we'll talk about later, and the second CPU from our viewer Skyfish. In both instances of 0 ohm shorts, the motherboard was still working. In the instance of the low resistance short, however, the motherboard incinerated itself to the point of melting the socket. SpeedRookie's system was that one, and it was still on after the failure because power good was still asserted. That implies that either Asus has OCP that's too high, such as on loop 2, or the chip burned in a way that the low resistance kept it being fed current. If the CPU is destroyed in such a way that the motherboard shuts down, obeying OCP and OTP, then the silicon will be damaged irreparably, but the motherboard will survive. Low resistance shorts can break OCP and other protections, which may allow for the motherboard to remain on and shoving current into a dead chip. In such an instance, and especially if a motherboard vendor like Asus configured loop 2 OCP to be too high, to where it's ineffective, This system ends up in a state where the board continually attempts to power up a dead CPU, sort of like a boot loop, with improper or blown apart protection mechanisms. An additional form of catastrophic failure could be the indium melting and shorting the SMDs on the CPU. In conversations with experts in the industry, apart protection mechanisms. An additional form of catastrophic failure could be the indium melting and shorting the SMDs on the CPU. In conversations with experts in the industry, many of whom we can't name, we received confirmation that a low resistance short like this could lead to a catastrophic motherboard failure. However, in our final hours of attempting to reproduce the motherboard incinerating itself problem, we made a new discovery that threw a wrench into the gears, and that discovery was an additional failure path. In the final test, we ran the 7800X3D in the Asus Hero with full cooling. We ran a Prime 95 small FFT heat load and monitored the thermals. Now, it's well known at this point that a high VSO set point of, say, 1.35 volts, especially if it actualizes as 1.4 volts, which is what was happening, that will slowly degrade a CPU, and it could eventually lead to this failure that we saw. It's a time bomb on an extended scale. Maybe never if you have a really good piece of silicon. But worse lottery pulls on chips will yield failures faster, so it's just an aging problem. We chose a VSOC set point of 1.45 volts, which is actually within 50 millivolts of what some motherboard vendors were originally running anyway. Now, this is high, but the point of this is a rapid simulation of aging and silicon degradation of an equivalent, let's say 1.35 volt set point, which was the original Asus set point we'll talk about later, over maybe 6 months of use. In any event, even with a 50 millivolt higher than board vendor set point VSOC, the result shouldn't be fire. It should be some kind of protection. They're supposed to be in place. We observed as our clamped VSOC pads that we soldered to climbed slowly from a combination of leakage, heat load, and a screwy Asus VRM configuration to actually 1.5 volt SoC despite a much lower set point. This is insane, and it's what'll happen from prolonged exposure to excessive ODM voltages. Eventually, without ever hitting TJ Maxx and therm tripping in the OS, we were still under temperature control here, overcurrent protection kicked in instead, and the system partially shut down to a 00 BIOS code. This is normal. We observed that the fans weren't spinning in this state, which made us wonder if that's leading to a thermal failure from very slow cooking, say overnight. Fortunately, this was not the case, as Wendell noted in our simultaneous testing call.
If you've got a board that's on, but you're getting 00, but the SoC voltage is on, then it probably could sit in that state forever.
But we allowed the system to run in the 00 state for a while, and we even removed the cooler completely. It's not like it was on anyway. The CPU IHS never breached 38 degrees Celsius in thermal imaging with an RSE 600, so this alone doesn't cause the failure, but it's related to one. AMD's external mechanism for throttling the CPU is proc high, usually asserted by the VRM, which would allow it to avoid an over-temperature protection shutdown. But something didn't work here. So we flipped the power supply off, then we flipped the switch off, we remounted the cooler, and we turned the system on. Instantaneously, we were met with this. That's it, we did it.
We desoldered it.
We desoldered the CPU in the socket. Here's what happened. The part is obviously shorted out. We're very close to it in this state. So what should have happened after the first OCP kicked in and shut us down is Asus's OCP should have taken over on that next boot and prohibited the scenario we ended up in. We reached out to an electrical engineer embedded deeply with this issue, can't name, and we asked for some additional assistance in explaining it. And they put it in simple terms. The engineer said, yeah, that's Asus's OCP f***ing up. So everyone can understand that. When you turn on the power supply and attempt to boot it like we did, the system immediately knows there's a short, and it should cut the power at that point. Asus even has an extra embedded controller on these high-end boards, and that controller could be leveraged for additional fail-safes in really cool ways to prevent any of this from happening. Unfortunately, laziness prevented Asus from taking advantage of its own advertising and marketing gimmick, which is the controller. It could be not a gimmick. From the board's perspective, a 00 code means that the power good signal has not yet been asserted. So the CPU should be holding itself in reset until the power stabilizes. 00 is basically the same as no CPU present at all. Once the power good signal is asserted, it'll start the process and exit 00. 00 is essentially holding the board in a cold reset. You can see the system shoving current into the CPU even though it's clearly already shorted, and it can only lead to the socket melting. We watched as the current clamp climbed to 37 amps on the EPS 12 volt cables, or about 440 watts. The VRM can take it, so that means that OTP in the MOSFETs won't kick in. And we were running without a VRM heatsink anyway, so we actually put it in the best possible position to shut itself down safely. A real user would be at more risk here than we were. We pulled the cooler when we started seeing smoke, and the thermal camera revealed that the CPU was at 200 degrees Celsius. Insanely, we noticed that the substrate of the CPU was hotter than the IHS itself. This, in combination with the crack we heard, indicates to us that the CPU literally desoldered itself and sunk all the heat into the substrate instead of the IHS, but it was already long dead at this point. And because ASUS has an unreasonably high OCP for these CPUs really in general, the end result is that the CPU continues to get force-fed current that it eventually can't handle. And that's in a 00 state, no cooling potentially. This is pretty damning, and changing the VSOC isn't enough here. That's the lazy approach. It's a catch-all, but there's more that could be done. And ASUS and AMD both need to take action. If we were ASUS, here's how we'd look at this scenario, this bad scenario. 37 amps in this test at say 80+% efficiency puts us at 400 watts at least for being force-fed into the CPU. And this is for a non-overclockable CPU that was not overclocked with a nominal TDP of say 120 watts, maybe 170 watts if you're running something high-end. So the OCP here is way overrated for what's actually in the socket, and that's bad. The fact that it was at 400 watts at least and power good was still not asserted indicates to us minimally that ASUS's fancy premium controller and its fancy premium motherboard should at least be detecting, let's say, the CPU is on for 5 seconds, or attempting to be on, and it's receiving excessive current. Maybe we should do something about that and shut the system down. The controller has these capabilities. They could also reconfigure OCP to be lower. Again, these aren't overclockable chips anyway, and for the overclockers and for XOC, you can always manually bypass that. So it's not taking away any of the levers that we have, it's just enforcing stricter ones for more likely stock scenarios. And ASUS isn't alone here. AMD has a lot it can improve as well, besides just the communication, which AMD's kind of always struggled with.
What's up, gamers?
And we haven't even gotten to Gigabyte yet. That's in a few minutes. This particular issue should have never made it out of ASUS. And it's up to AMD, the makers of the CPU and the chipset, the ones who have the actual knowledge of what it can tolerate safely, to enforce and police its partners in a way that at least makes them follow these basic guidelines. You don't want too much enforcement and too many restrictions on the partners because it restrains creativity and it stops the motherboard market from being as diverse and interesting as it is, and it could have knock-on bad effects for enthusiast things like overclocking. But in the very least, something like this is not unreasonable for AMD to add to its list of, hey, we should make sure the CPUs don't melt themselves in the socket because the motherboard vendor maybe did something stupid. It's up to AMD to tell ASUS that it is, in fact, an issue that could escalate to a safety issue. Now, it's extremely unlikely, but just to maybe scare some of these vendors into gear without hopefully pushing them too far, it is feasible that in the exact wrong scenario, with perhaps the wrong material buildup around the socket, with a short to ground somewhere else that's not accounted for in the CPU or board, you could potentially get into a scenario where there's a complete runaway and a house fire, or at least a small containable fire. Extremely unlikely, to emphasize that, but we've seen it before, and we've repaired user systems that have been through such scenarios. So, AMD, at least, is responsible for getting insights from its partners and providing them to make sure that settings like OCP are not incompetently set, perhaps under an assumption that guidance really is just guidance, as in you should do this, not, hey, it's gonna fail if you do this the wrong way. Now it's time to move to the delidding for internal inspection. So for this, we completely preserved the motherboard and the CPU from SpeedRookie. Those are the important ones. We did not tamper with them at all beyond probing some specific pins, and we informed the FA lab which those were. So instead, we delidded the CPU from Skyfish, because that's the one that came with the Gigabyte board that still works. We confirmed it's working. It even got the BIOS F5A or whatever it is. The other one, it'll go through submersive acoustic testing, scanning electron microscopes, and more. But to delid the CPU while preserving as much damage as we could, Patrick and Vitaly flossed the 8 legs of the CPU to cut through the adhesive without affecting surface mount devices.
It's like being a dentist.
It's like cutting down a tree.
Are you a dentist or a lumberjack? Changing professions. You give this guy a string of floss and he's like 3 different professions. Once done, I clamped the CPU lightly in a vise and shoved a thermocouple under the heat spreader. Using guidance from our friend and community-voted #1 bromance of the year, Dare Bauer, we used a heat gun to heat the IHS up to 160 degrees Celsius, approximately the melting point of the indium solder holding the heat spreader to the silicon. At this point, the lid fell freely, no prying required whatsoever, and we were able to delid it without any damage to the silicon itself. We took some microscope photos and videos, and we sent those to the external component failure analyst we worked with, again for 12-volt high power, and the same analyst said this, quote, "I'm seeing a cracked die from the high heat of the overstress event. Cracks emanate from the center melt site. That's not something you could have done with the delid. There's evidence of overheating, that's the darkened silicon, and of melted silicon, 1410 degrees Celsius melting point, if so. There may be a few others right of center. Fortunately, acoustic scans should clue us into whether such material discontinuities are present prior to destructive testing. Sometimes when larger scale EOS or electrical overstress occurs, a lot of different surrounding materials are pulled into the fray. I think this is what happened here too," our analyst said. "It looks like an organic material has bubbled up through the silicon melt site. The nearest organic polymer could be at the active side, where the connection from the die to the substrate occurs. That is surrounded by an organic-like solder mask or underfill. The easy solution would be to run it through EDS, or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, to confirm." Yes, easy. That is why we're sending it to them. And the result was a ripple that cracked the silicon from the inside out. You can actually see it originating at that scorch mark. It exploded to such an extreme that it bulged the land grid array outward on the bottom of the CPU. When we scoped our own dead X3D that we killed during the course of testing, and more on that later, we saw a burn mark in nearly the same spot on the SoC. More importantly though, we noticed at least one of these CPUs had discoloration of the epoxy at the edge of the CCD and a scorch mark on the adjacent part of the substrate. Actually, in fact, VSOC feeds part of the CCD. And so there may be an issue here of a voltage differential where it is forced to exit through the explosion of the silicon. So to do our next part of analysis, we used some images from Locuza, who posts a lot of very high quality photography of dies and die shots online and does phenomenal work. And we transformed that by multiplying it as a mask on top of the damaged silicon. First, we used a clean delidded die that we also have here, and we scoped it to figure out the orientation of Locuza's image. Then we multiplied the image onto the failed I/O die. The failure within the I/O die appears to be in the middle of the GPU core complex, which actually drives the display PHY. Interestingly, we learned that the AMD IGP is one of the I/O die parts that's fed voltage via vCore, not just VSOC. We have a voltage block diagram we acquired from a contact at a motherboard manufacturer that confirms again that VSOC actually goes to part of the CCD. It's specifically this combination of the damage at the edge of the CCD with the discoloration of epoxy and the scorch mark, plus the I/O die scorch mark within the GPU complex, that led us down the path of this is probably why it exploded. And it was such an explosion that Gigabyte's power supply team would blush. We brought this next theory to a different contact, our friend Wendell from Level 1 Techs, and he had this to say. This makes sense because we know there are different voltages going into different parts of the I/O die and chiplets. The voltage differential has to go somewhere. Those are probably not completely isolated circuits. You're going to have some leakage even if they're perfectly isolated, but the reality is they probably aren't. You're going to have at least the logic circuits talking to each other between those sides. If you have a voltage differential, the differential has to be sunk to ground somewhere, somehow. In other words, it's going to go to heat. The voltage differential could go to heat that the processor experiences in a way that the engineers did not anticipate because the voltage is so much higher than stock. It'd be 50% higher if it's 1 volt versus 1.5 volts or whatever. I would go so far as to say it's not even really just the voltage by itself. If you have a really high voltage, but you only let a few electrons through, that's fine. But the SoC could be saying, no, I'm in boot up mode, I need all the current. And it makes sense why it'd be tricky to catch in QA or QC, since it's likely on an axis where a combination of silicon quality between I/O die and CCD are related. You rolled a 1 for the I/O die, for the CCD, and for the BIOS quality control? Congratulations, what do you win? Rapid unscheduled disassembly. Thanks, Wendell, for the quote. I'll use that forever. Now, the BIOS quality control point is important. This brings us to the next aspect of this, which is it's not just an AMD thing, it comes down to the board vendors as well. Prior to any of the physical testing, we noticed one big problem with the ASUS board specifically. In order to do this testing, we soldered some leads to the ASUS X670E Crosshair Hero to get more accurate readings on the SoC voltage that's actually delivered. Methodologically, this is necessary because software reporting and BIOS settings are often different from what can be measured. And a massive shout out to Elmore from Elmore Labs for helping us with some guidance on the right direction to go for this section. Elmore provided us some expert insight that helped us formulate test plans and also builds custom overclocking tools, external voltage controllers, one of which we're using, and other cool enthusiast gear. You can find him on elmorelabs.com. I just want to jump back in here for a second and say this piece was awesome to work on because we collaborated with so many experts in the industry. Some could be named, some couldn't, but to all of you, thank you. It's been a lot of fun working on it. So here are our findings. Enabling Expo has the Crosshair Hero running at 1.35 volts SoC set in the BIOS. By set, what we mean is that's the number it says, but not necessarily what it reads. This is already very high by AMD's own standards though. And AMD's new statement says it shouldn't go higher than 1.3. The actual voltage delivered when probed at SoC MLCCs or on the VSoC check pads on the board is 1.4 volts. We saw one spike up to 1.41, despite the already high 1.35 volt in BIOS, and we often saw it, most commonly, sitting at about a 1.39 volt reading like you see here. That's getting dangerously high for the CPU, and at this point this is also something AMD has confirmed. But we'll come back to that. One thing is for certain, ASUS is running its SoC voltage way too high. It should be closer to 1.3 volts, or ideally 1.25 volts. And the reason to blast the SoC voltage like this largely comes down to laziness. It's the lazy way to ensure that there's wide compatibility without finer, deeper tuning to the BIOS in order to get the memory compatibility that they want. As for these numbers we're reporting, so we confirmed this on BIOS 0922, that was one just before the official X3D support. We also confirmed this behavior of the 1.4-ish voltage for SoC on 1101. That BIOS officially supported X3D, but don't let ASUS trick you because they retconned it and decided, oops, no it doesn't. But it did, originally. It said it supported X3D. And then we also confirmed this behavior on 1202. That is the last BIOS that ASUS left on its site before it started hiding and burying all prior BIOSes. So they all lazily blast VSoC. Because Patrick and I were so slammed trying to get the content through the pipeline, we again reached out to Wendell and asked him for assistance checking more motherboards. He was happy to assist, maybe a little too happy. We are gonna film the death of this CPU.
Or try to film the death of the CPU.
Here's what Wendell found. Using a mixture of leads wired to the boards like we did and hardware info, Wendell noted that the ASRock Live Mixer B650 board pulled 1.01 volts on auto, 1.20 volts for BIOS set to Expo 1, and 1.246 volts with Prime 95 loading it. He found the Phantom Gaming pulled between 1.22 and 1.24 with Expo, depending on if Prime was loading it, and he found that Gigabyte It was at 1.2 to 1.22 volts. MSI was at 1.19 to 1.2 volts as well. So ASUS is a little bit of an outlier here. They're much higher than all of those, but they're still not alone. They're not the only reason these things can fail. That's where part AMD and part other board vendors comes in, because if you remember, Skyfish's system was a Gigabyte board. That one failed. The motherboard lived though. And the Gigabyte board didn't even have Expo turned on according to Skyfish. So that would be closer to 1.0 VSOC, which makes things a little trickier. That's probably where the FA lab will come in a few weeks. So we think it's more than VSOC, and if you look at AMD's statement, they did talk about tuning other voltages, including VSOC, but we'll come back to that. And we're also aware of at least one BioStar board that was at or in excess of 1.4 volts SOC as well. But one important note here for Expo. Expo itself, think of it again as sort of an XMP, it has nothing to do within the profiles about VSOC. Expo does not contain a number for the SoC or the system on chip voltage. Applying Expo shouldn't necessarily state that you are also applying a dangerously high voltage. That's on the motherboard vendors. That is ASUS's decision to do that. So Expo, although it is a potential trigger if configured incorrectly by the motherboard vendor, itself is not the cause for this. Just want to make that really clear, because Expo is pretty cool. It has a lot of really high quality tuning and timings built into it for the different kits, and that's what's making AMD as competitive as it is right now, because without it, they're kind of weak. Regardless, SoC voltages of 1.4 are clearly not necessary. In the week or so of testing that we ran on this, we found a whole host of other bugs, some related to this, some not, but there were a lot of them, and we can't fit them all in this video. We tried, it added 15 minutes. We're gonna run a follow-up piece with some more information on that, some ranting about how this was handled very poorly in a lot of cases by everybody, AMD and motherboard vendors, especially ASUS though. But that's a separate thing. So the main issues, the severe ones from this piece, were proc hot, VSOC problems of various types, and OCP being basically improperly executed. To quickly recap some of the other ones we found, because we've never had to dig this hard into AMD's AM5 platform before, here's the short version. On some platforms, we noticed the X3D CPUs were shutting down at inappropriately high temperatures for over temperature. So on ASRock, Gigabyte, and MSI, various boards, we observed in combination with Wendell a 116 degree thermal trip point. But on ASUS, for the board we tested, it was 106. It's supposed to be 106 for X3D and 116 for non-X3D. So this got royally screwed up by at least 3 board partners, which to us means AMD is at fault for not communicating it properly and offering adequate support to those partners. On Gigabyte F5A, we observed a potentially fatal bug where it was sometimes not possible to reset VSOC to auto or defaults, and on ASUS we noted another bug where loading Expo via the AMD overclocking menu provided by the AMD adhesive binary rather than the ASUS menu would load the correct SoC voltage. So it'd often be 1.2 or 1.25, while ASUS's menu was loading it at 1.35 for the BIOSes we were testing, except for those newest patches that came out. Now, unfortunately, ASUS has another bug, or AMD does, it's in their menu after all, where it doesn't load the correct VDDIO voltage using this menu. That results in blue screens and crashes because it's the wrong VDDIO. Honestly, this platform is just a complete mess, and we didn't realize that going into the initial reviews because we followed our standard reviews process and everything works fine for the purposes of testing other than whatever we might have noted in those reviews. But this issue necessitated a much deeper look, exploring a lot more settings, a lot more combinations of hardware, and it just made it look really much messier than the standard approach does. So that's not good for AM5. And there were more bugs that, again, we're not even talking about here because they're just not related enough. For the rest, here's the quick and final rundown for now. This, as always, is not fully and definitively conclusive because it's an extremely complex issue. It's really hard to replicate this problem. It took us the entire time to get the catastrophic failure to happen. So that should reduce your concerns significantly. We had to actively try to find out how to make this happen. Doesn't mean it won't accidentally happen. Probably a much higher likelihood, honestly, than trying. But the point is, it's not easy. And so that should temper sort of the concern about how likely is this to happen to you. We had a limited sample size, of course, and we also were working off of changing information. Now, the good news here is we had some extremely conclusive results. So we're out of hypothesis territory and into just actually proven fact with some of these problems. The OCP issue, that was proven fact. The theory about a sort of voltage differential causing an escape path that is undesirable, that's in theory territory. Here's the bulleted recap. AMD and its partners are actively rolling out BIOSes to address this. Most address it by locking down the VSOC. The rollout has been complete chaos. Asus, for example, is clearly incapable of getting the CPU names right. Gigabyte doesn't get out unscathed either. They have their own rollout issues. AMD is offering replacements for CPUs killed in this manner. That's even if Expo is on. We asked AMD and we confirmed that at least the US will have free shipping both directions if one of your CPUs dies. Motherboard vendors may not be so kind. It's to be determined. Next question of, is this resolved? We believe the SoC clampdown is inadequate as a blanket fix. It's a quick fix, and it resolves a lot of the concerns of longevity and slowly damaging the processor over time. And remember, that's sort of what you get with typing in a higher VSOC is you simulate that aging much faster. But in a real use case, running at 1.4 for months or a year on end or whatever, you're gonna lose some kind of ability over time, and maybe it results in a failure, maybe it doesn't. It depends on the chip quality, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is you should stop running at that voltage because there's no reason to. Maybe there's some memory stability problems, but you could probably bring it down to a more reasonable 1.3 or something. The Asus OCP problem needs to be resolved separately. The Gigabyte problem, where it just refuses to listen to user input and won't zero out and reset to auto the SoC voltage on some BIOSes, that's another problem too. And right now, as an end user wondering if this affects you, here's the answer. If you have X3D especially, but really any of them, you should update BIOS. You should check VSOC as a baseline on hardware info. There's a free version. This number isn't perfect, but it's a good start. And some boards have embedded controllers that give you even more accurate information that's more useful. If VSOC is greater than 1.3 when you're looking at this, lower it manually. You should check under load and idle. Remember that set point VSOC can often be different from actualized, but typically not as much as that 50 millivolt deviation we saw earlier. Also, X3D is more fragile. So this has been a lot of fun. It's been really exciting to work on this. It's a different process from the standard reviews. There's just sort of a lot of mental puzzling with it, trying to figure it out. Video's long enough though, and at this point, just the reminder that there are always limitations to testing. We've worked very hard to close all those loops that we can. There are still, of course, limitations, and that's why we're gonna have follow-ups, but even then, if some new information pops up, please make sure we see it. You can tweet it at us or something, and we feel pretty good about the results that we found, but some of our attempts at explanation, of course, rely on assumptions. So that's the one thing we want to make sure everyone keeps in mind, just full transparency. We tested Asus the most heavily since it was the clearest offender, but that doesn't mean other motherboards can't also have been problematic. And ultimately updating the BIOS, quickly checking VSOC, that should be enough to just put it out of your mind once you do that, because any other issues are probably out of your control anyway and just pending more updates. And there's no point being anxious about something that you have absolutely no control over anyway. So we're doing more testing. We'll keep you all updated. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab this shirt to help us out directly and support our efforts. This is for 15 years in business now. We've been doing it a while, and we're looking forward to another 15. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time. pretty crazy today. We sent a CPU to a failure analysis lab to learn why it might have exploded and what the aftermath was. This is the process of a failed AMD 7800X3D getting acoustically scanned with a non-destructive technique, allowing us to see what the internal defects of the chip might be. The CPU also got X-rayed to show us what might have gone wrong, while also being microscoped to reveal how the substrate exploded outward when the CPU failed. We were also able to see the internal solder application to reveal voids, plus energy dispersive X-ray to reveal more about the material properties. And finally, the failure analysis lab we sent this to cross-sectioned the CPU in sectioning epoxy to get as close as possible to the point of failure. And this is one of the coolest videos we've ever made. It's the follow-up to part 1, where we were able to successfully reproduce a failure seen on Reddit, where a motherboard and a CPU mutually incinerated. And that's already live, so you should check it out if you haven't seen it. It gives all the foundation for this one. This one, though, focuses on looking at the damage signature of a CPU, and our next one, the final one in this series, we'll talk about ASUS and our many problems with how they've handled this. But today it's more of an objective focus, and less rage. Before that, this video is brought to you by Warframe and its brand new update, the Duviri Paradox. The newest update makes it easy for returning players to jump in right away with tons of new content, but also adds a path for new players to start out. These updates go beyond just cosmetics and quality of life changes. There are tons of new elements to the game and a completely unique, massive new open world to explore. And for action RPG or third-person shooter and slasher fans, Warframe is worth the free download to put your gaming PC to work. The new update features a new cinematic quest alongside highly replayable roguelite missions. A few of us on the team at GN play Warframe and like the game, so it was a natural sponsor fit. Check out Warframe, the Duviri Paradox at the link below and use the code on the screen for extra unlocks. We're extremely excited about this content today because we get to learn about hardware failures at a depth we rarely get to encounter. So we expedited a shipment of a burned motherboard and CPU over to the same failure analysis lab that we worked with for the NVIDIA 12-volt high power failures. So they've got some experience working on this stuff now. And there's a few parts to failure analysis in general. So namely, for what we're doing, there's root cause analysis. That's what our team did here, where we were able to more or less determine a few likely reasons, the root cause of failures that we've seen online. And then another part is sort of a post-mortem. When we were doing root cause analysis originally, we found a couple points of failure in voltages and the OCP, or the overcurrent protection, that was configured on the motherboard, alongside considerations of shortcomings on the overtemperature protection mechanisms. And you can support our root cause analysis and content production by grabbing one of these super limited GN15 shirts celebrating our 15th anniversary over on store.gamersnexus.net. They have a super vibrant blue foil along with a gold foil for the 15, and on the back there's a subscriber graph as we ascend towards 2 million subscribers. These always sell through really quickly whenever we do a limited edition shirt, so we expect these to be gone within a few weeks, and it directly funds the massive effort that we've had to put in for this specific series of 3 parts of content. So if you like this kind of work and you want a cool limited shirt in return to commemorate 15 years, support us, and get something nice, then head over to store.gamersnexus.net. So the next part of failure analysis is more of an internal look. It looks structurally and electrically at what could have possibly gone wrong, and our team currently can't do this. We don't have the tools. So we send the parts out to an external professional lab that's able to assist with this type of testing, and that lab does validation and FA of failed semiconductors and other equipment that we can't get into. These labs use a mix of specialized equipment to first perform non-destructive testing, which is necessary to preserve the integrity of the failure, and then they advance to destructive testing, which you can't go back from, to double-check their hypotheses. This lab we work with does phenomenal work, and to the failure analyst engineer watching, our sincere thank you for your patience and all of your effort into this. Unfortunately, we can't name the lab or the engineer for reasons which we also can't name. But on behalf of the community, we all appreciate the ability to bring this type of information to the public eye, instead of letting it just get sort of hidden and then a silent update fixes it in the future. In this case, really loud update because they were exploding, but... Oh, it's on fire. Yeah, I can smell it. Okay, as we get into it, here's what we have. Acoustic scan imaging, and EDS, or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, SEM, examination or scanning electron microscopes, cross sections. We have the acoustic scanning while the CPU is submersed in water. We have a scan of substrate connections, a low mag polarized optical, where we can see the exploded substrate where it's cracked, and we also have a CT scan showing us the pyrolyzed materials. We'll start with an external physical and visual inspection where we can look at the CPU like we did in the first video, but with a bit more depth. And in our first look, we talked about a low resistance short theory that may have led to the runaway scenario. Now, before getting to destructive delidding, looking this particular CPU and board over, we can quickly identify that the bottom of the substrate bulged outward as a result of a literal internal explosion. You can actually see where the substrate's starting to crack, and that explosion had enough force to suppress the underlying pins in the motherboard socket, resulting in the images we've all already seen. When we sent this initial information to our failure analyst contact, the analyst sent the following initial images, and this is all prior to us sending the sample out. Quote, overvoltage could knock out a dielectric quickly, transient or longer term, time-dependent dielectric breakdown. That would be what people mean when they say degradation. And with the interlevel dielectric degraded and some electrical leakage established, the resulting current could start causing permanent damage. The other EOS, or electrical overstress possibility, is overcurrent, where the current supplied exceeds the current carrying capacity of the metallization, or to a point where the connected junction can no longer dissipate the power supply. Of course, continued cycling of the device in this degraded state would exacerbate the damage observed. Each of these could have happened to get the damage we're seeing presently. You've reproduced one of those possibilities. Now, our first failure analysis test that the lab performed is CSAM, or C-mode Scanning Acoustic Microscopy, and this one is helpful for determining if there's a defect in the solder application. So out of the factory from AMD, is the solder defective to an extent that it would cause this failure? It's also very useful in determining if the die underneath the IHS is so cracked that pulling it apart would damage it to a point where we can no longer come to a conclusion as to what the failure is. So that's necessary just to know how to progress with the destructive testing. And this machine is super cool. The FA lab described this to us as a high-frequency ultrasonic energy in excess of 20 kilohertz to non-destructively search for defects. For this test, the failed device is submerged in deionized water, which is necessary because ultrasound in excess of 10 megahertz can't propagate in air. Our contact told us that the transducer array within the microscope is carefully selected to balance the spot size of the ultrasound with the penetration depth. In other words, using the finest detail spot size with 8.6 microns of resolution allows a better image, but 300 megahertz can't get through the IHS. The lab instead used a 50 megahertz transducer for this. The lab noted that this allowed them to see through the water, through the IHS, and the gold and indium interface under the IHS. The echo bounces off of these parts, and an image is rendered of the internal components. That's what you're seeing now. Because this image stops before the silicon and the substrate, we're able to see the quality of AMD's solder application. But note that this is after the component failure. Here we can see voids within the solder application for both the CCD and the I/O die. The voids are indicated by the gaps within that yellow coloration within the black solder area. These voids could be a few different things. First, they could just be manufacturing defects, but these voids are acceptable manufacturing variants from what our FA lab contact tells us, and they're unlikely to be the cause for the CPU dying. We even noticed some in Jay's video when he mechanically delidded a CPU, no heat involved, that has similar voids. We've at least, in this case, ruled out voids as the cause for this CPU's failure. Secondly, they could be the result from over temperature of the CPU, wherein the solder liquefied or effectively desoldered itself and then rehardened. We found that AMD's indium solder solution cracks at about 158 degrees Celsius, and likely this is the point at which it becomes liquidous. An over-temperature event would have happened as a result of the failure anyway, so we've effectively ruled out these two options as the actual cause. And that's the reality of a lot of what we're doing today. It's ruling things out to narrow in on the most likely possible cause for the failure. And maybe they'll point us towards the things we said in our first video, but it's important to get rid of some of those questions about could it be manufacturing variants or these other many things that it could possibly be. With the basic acoustic imaging complete, we can now move to some X-ray analysis. We have two types of scans here. One is a sort of normal two-dimensional X-ray like you might use to inspect someone's bone or something. And the other one is a 3D scan, or computed tomography, commonly known as a CT scan. Same idea as in the medical world, just using them on different devices. So this is our first step towards destructive analysis, because the thick metal IHS ended up actually interfering with the X-ray at all and thus it had to be removed to complete the testing. But the functional parts of the CPU are still intact, and the IHS was removed as delicately as possible to preserve the underlying damage. Along with acoustic scanning, this confirms that none of the silicon is completely smashed, which would make the next steps a lot more difficult. The X-rays reveal that some of the copper BGA bumps connecting the CCD to the substrate are melted. This is visible in the 2D images as dark specks between the regular circular bumps and the cylindrical vias. A 3D CT scan makes the problem much more obvious, with large gaps between the remaining bumps across the middle of the CCD. This is evidence of extremely high temperatures. For example, the melting point of copper, about 1085 degrees Celsius, is much higher than that of any solder in the CPU. Interestingly, there was no evidence of similar damage underneath the I/O die. And this is interesting too, because in one of the CPUs we delidded, or actually a couple of them, the largest point of externally visible to the human eye damage was actually in the I/O die in the GPU PHY, something we talked about the first time. Now, we saw damage alongside and adjacent to the CCD, especially on the edges that are closest to the I/O die, but with at least the samples we delidded previously, we couldn't see those large explosion marks or cracks forming that it looks like this sample might have. That doesn't mean that the failure type or cause is different, it just means that the way it manifested is different. You're talking about exploding silicon and melting it, potentially, so there's a lot that could go wrong in a lot of places. Now, before getting to the scanning electron microscope, we next have a look at an extremely high magnification, sort of normal microscope, and this one will give us a look at the silicon surface. This shot gives you an idea for just how deep the zoom goes. This AMD copyright mark, something we never knew even existed on the CPUs, is less than 60 microns wide. That's super cool that they even bother to do this. It's basically only for nerds who are inspecting it at this level. To get these shots, our contact chopped off the half of the CPU containing the I/O die, leaving the CCD side alone, and dissolved the substrate with fuming nitric acid, leaving just the clean I/O die. In addition to silicon, that also includes the aluminum top layer and inner copper layers, still protected by the yellow-tinted silicon nitride glassivation layer. Remember that this is flip chip silicon, so the sort of top aluminum layer is the side that was originally face down against the substrate. The crazing on the surface is just the natural grain pattern of the aluminum layer. The large dark circles are where the BGA balls were before they were dissolved by nitric acid, while the smaller circles within the aluminum traces are connections running down into the copper layers. This is all fascinating, but it doesn't show us any problems, yet. From our contact, quote, some etching defects are visible where the copper bumps terminated to the die metallization, but no other issues are present. That's not to say that issues are not present under all the stacked metallization, but at this point we can rule out excessive electrical overstress for this specific I/O die. After the normal super high mag microscopy, we can now look at the scanning electron microscope. So SEM gives us two main points of detail for these CPUs. The first one that we're going to look at is EDS, or Energy Dispersive Spectroscopy. And the second one is high-resolution imaging. EDS measures the wavelengths of X-rays emitted when the microscope's electron beam hits the sample, which can be mapped to specific elements. This should give us a better idea of what we're looking at as we examine black and white electron microscope images. Performing EDS on a cross-section of the CCD still mounted to its substrate gives us a colored dot map of the aluminum metallized silicon die above an aluminum pad, which is in turn bonded to a copper bump. This is all public information that AMD has revealed. Our contact pointed out areas where copper reflowed, as well as flecks of, his words, insta-jibbed copper and silicon. You can't escape the Quake references, even in the failure analysis community. We can see the extreme heat this was subjected to. It's clear that it was a buildup as current continued to get shoved into the chip, not just an instantaneous shock and explosion. There's enough residue here and evidence from other imaging to know that the CPU became slowly overloaded and then effectively rapidly melted down. Finally, we're moving on to the cross-section. This is still part of the SEM imaging that we've been talking about. So for this one, the failure analyst cross-sectioned the silicon and mounted it in a sectioning epoxy, which keeps it all intact, but allows a really close internal inspection that you can't see otherwise. And for this, the analyst noted that the plane of the section intersects the CCD and the blistered part of the LGA that we saw earlier, the land grid array on the bottom of the CPU. We'll start with some plain optical microscope shots just to get our bearings. The big rectangle on the top is the silicon die, mounted in the lighter gray underfill that keeps it securely attached to the substrate underneath. Underneath that lies the substrate, which is a 5-2-5 stack, or 5 layers, power and ground planes, that's the 2, and then 5 more layers. In the middle is a layer of fiberglass, crossed vertically by copper vias. That's the sort of tubes you can see running through it. The fiberglass core is pyrolyzed and delaminated, as are the layers of foil and the prepreg on the top of the chip and the bottom socket sides. We need to zoom in further to get to the source though. Only the bottommost silicon is active. The rest is structural. That's where you see that sort of gray, inactive looking material. The tiny reflective lines along the bottom edge of the die are the layers of metallization and glassivation that we saw earlier. The glassivation protects the silicon. At least it protects it when you start dissolving the stuff around it, as we did earlier. The actual transistors here end up being too small to see. So this is the site of the biggest identifiable crack in the silicon. At the bottom of that crack, we can see the underfill has burned away from the silicon surface, and some of the high temperature solder connecting the die to the substrate has also melted away completely. It's genuinely insane to see this level of detail of a failure. It's crazy. We're really privileged to be able to share this with you all and to have a contact with the equipment and the knowledge necessary to help us with all this. Further to the left, there's another burned site directly above the deformation in the substrate. The underfill is almost completely gone here. Still moving to the left, there's yet another burn. These multiple sites make it difficult to say where the failure was initiated, but we have some ideas and we'll kind of walk through those. We'll call these sites 1, 2, and 3, numbered from left to right, with 3 being the one with the large crack. Now let's move back to the big boy microscope. Our contact described the SEM as, quote, an expensive light bulb. The analyst said, quote, our SEM is basically a cylindrical column containing a tungsten filament at the top and a sample chamber at the bottom. A massive potential of 20 kilovolts is created between the top column filament and the bottom of the chamber, which bleeds electrons down the column, striking the sample. Prior to inspection of the SEM, the cross-section CCD was coated in a 20 angstrom layer of gold to help with charge dissipation. Our contact continued and said when a sample is hit with an electron beam, a lot of cool things occur within a teardropped shape volume on the sample, called the interaction volume. Of the products generated, this analysis focused on 2. Secondary electrons used for high-resolution imaging, and characteristic X-rays, which were used for materials analysis. Now, for context, when the analyst here is talking about secondary imaging, what is really being referenced is sub-micron level images. So it's far beyond what the human eye could ever hope to see, and in the instances we're looking at here, beyond even what you would get realistically with a normal microscope. Zoomed out, these images look just like the ones from the optical microscope, only black and white. Moving closer to site 2 though, we can now see delamination in the transparent layers of prepreg that's harder to pick out with a normal scope. We can also see the extent to which the underfill between the BGA balls was completely burned away. This area got hot. Here's a shot of what the connection between the die and the substrate should mostly look like, far to the left of any explosions at all. That gives us some basis to understand. At the bottom of the frame are the upper 5 layers of copper from the 5-2-5 substrate sandwich. Substrate sandwich, by the way, the name of the new flagship sandwich at the GN burger establishments. These 5 layers of copper carry signals from the socket. These layers are connected through the underfill with high temp solder to the copper BGA balls above, which contact the metallized parent die. Above that on the right is the 64 megabyte cache die, while the non-metallized rectangle on the left is structural. The line of erosion that we're seeing in the middle of the parent die layer shouldn't be there. Here's a closer shot. These are 2 dies. The 64 megabyte cache die is stacked on top of the parent die. From this perspective, the bottom layer is aluminum, followed by copper on nickel. The line of erosion that we're seeing is metallized parent die. Above that on the right is the 64 megabyte cache die, while the non-metallized layers of copper carry signals from substrate sandwich, by the way, the name of the new flagship sandwich at the GN burger establishments. These 5 layers of copper carry signals from the socket. These layers are connected through the underfill with high temp solder to the copper BGA balls above, which contact the metallized parent die. Above that on the right is the 64 megabyte cache die, while the non-metallized rectangle on the left is structural. The line of erosion that we're seeing in the middle of the parent die layer shouldn't be there. Here's a closer shot. These are two dies. The 64 megabyte cache die is stacked on top of the parent die. From this perspective, the bottom layer is aluminum, followed by copper layers, the visible traces we saw earlier under the I/O die, and above that are the actual transistors, still so tiny that they can't be seen. And then there's a thick layer of silicon substrate. The layer between the parent and the cache is pierced vertically by copper through silicon vias. The delamination here runs through the metallization layer of the parent die. Other than burned underfill, sites 1 and 3 look similar. Site 3 has the big, attention-grabbing silicon substrate crack, but the active silicon isn't that much worse here than it is elsewhere. Site 2 shows the area right above the exploded substrate. And that's where the gory details lie, the ones that'll get us demonetized. We can zoom in even closer though. Here's an area where the delamination is so extreme that the metallized layers are bent out of shape. The die didn't split in half here, but the silicon of the parent die is cracked and crumbling. The real prize of this analysis is here though. There's clear evidence of the copper BGA bump melting away, and immediately above a vertical crack through the parent die that appears to show melted silicon. If so, that would indicate temperatures of at least 1400 degrees Celsius. But we do know that this particular CPU at least was able to melt copper, which is still pretty damn hot. As for what all of this actually means, we have some ideas working with the failure analyst to connect the points of where did the failure probably start and where did it end and all the points in between, and it's pretty detailed. First of all, just to recap what we've run through and what we've collected to come to the best conclusion we possibly can, given the amount of damage that affects our ability to inspect this further. We've done external visual inspection, we've done radiographic inspection, so x-rays. We have at this point also done computed tomography or laminography. We did with the lab, of course, all of this acoustic scans or C-mode scanning acoustic microscopy. And then we also, with the FA lab, went through decapsulation of the IOC or the IO die, where it was sectioned and isolated in some epoxy. There's a metallurgical cross-section. There's EDS or energy dispersive X-ray, and then some internal inspection of the CCD with a normal microscope and with a scanning electron microscope. So that's the testing that was done. And the root cause analysis we already did. That's in part one, not gonna recap it here. So as for what we think happened, here's our best synopsis. The first thing is a disclaimer. We have to make some assumptions here because just like a fire in, say, a building or a house or something like that, or a forest, it's difficult to locate the original source when everything around it has been destroyed and burned up. In the case of this product, though, there was at least a clear end time when it stopped burning before it melted everything. So we can get a little more detail than, say, finding a cigarette in a forest somewhere. So this we can say for certain was a cascading failure. That much we know. One thing failed and then another and then another and then it catastrophically failed. Now, our existing knowledge allows us to postulate that a dielectric layer broke down at the transistor level. This degradation could have been caused by excessive VSOC over an extended period of runtime, or possibly as a result of poor thermal protections in combination with high VSOC. And because this particular CPU that got analyzed came out of the same ASUS motherboard that we know to have OCP set way too high, it's possible that that was another part of this. So it all kind of ties into the original analysis, at least for this part. And it is a different part. Now, this damage sustained by a dielectric layer in the process of silicon degradation is irreversible. So once it's begun, there's no fixing it, even by lowering VSOC. At most, what you could hope for is stopping the damage or preventing it from further degrading to a point of failure within the usable lifespan of the CPU. At some point, the leakage in this one may have increased local power dissipation, thus increasing leakage further. This is a vicious, inescapable cycle where it's effectively in a runaway failure scenario over an extended time initially, and then a short one at the end. After this further leakage, it's possible that the gate circuitry was hard shorted, leading it to demand yet more current that couldn't be dissipated in sufficient time. That then may have caused a meltdown near the parent die silicon. And if we look at our sample from Skyfish, you can even see a silicon melt site that indicates temperatures, again, excessive enough to melt silicon. After the parent silicon meltdown, we think it's possible this particular failure bridged to nearby components and possibly knocked out power rails. With OCP failings work on the ASUS boards,
Jesus Christ, 200 Celsius.
holy shit. And with the order of internal silicon components failing in what is effectively a random number generated die roll of catastrophe. Random generated die roll of catastrophe, by the way, the name of my new D&D standalone module. We can then see the current overwhelm the circuit, crack the die, and melt open the die metals. At this point, the temperature is definitely in excess of 160 degrees Celsius, so the indium solder melts and fails to transfer the heat to the IHS and thus fails to transfer it to the cooler, leading to now a runaway thermal scenario, as well as our overcurrent scenario. At this point, the heat can't escape the IHS, and it's forced to go through the silicon and the substrate. We saw this in our own thermography, where the substrate was at one point hotter than the IHS due to the TIM cracking and losing contact. Once the current exceeds the current carrying capacity of the substrate and the routing layers, it's possible that the traces internally fuse together and eventually blasts an escape route out of the bottom of the LGA, taking us back to the visual inspection externally. Now, that, to be very clear, is connecting a bunch of pieces of evidence of the failure to try and form a complete picture of what happened almost microsecond by microsecond within this failure to result in what we got, with the earlier root cause actually sort of lining up pretty cleanly with this. But there are some assumptions in there. Now, we asked our failure analyst, just to give us a full scope, what other types of failure modes might there be in addition to this? And the list is very long, but here's the short version. There could be a slew of application, environment, and manufacturing defects that could have assisted in the failure of the device that we can't verify on this current device. Ionic contamination, corrosion, dendritic growth, intermetallics, latch-up thermal runaway, dielectric breakdown, charge trapping due to high VSOC, hot carriers and tunneling. This is starting to sound like that Rockwell retro encabulator video. It could be mechanical overstress, so thermal expansion, localized CTE mismatch, excessive pressure, tensile overload, wafer process control like scratched, over-etching, under-etching, or poor ohmic contact, junction depth issues, EPI thickness, silicon stacking faults, incorrect doping, pipes, trapping sites, stress-induced voids, silicon nodules, oxide defects, hot carriers, metal deposition issues, metallization adherence issues. The list goes on. A lot can go wrong. And that list was just from us asking, hey, what else can go wrong to cause this type of failure? But the earlier information is what we think caused it here. So that's our best sort of analysis of the materials we have, including the root cause analysis we did previously. Extremely educational, really fun to work on. This story is mostly done at this point. We have one more piece at least that focuses, though, on the BIOS, the warranty issues, and ASUS being a massive scumbag of a company. But that video is less objectively focused and more focused on some of the don't be a scumbag company aspect of it. So it's the other half of our business. All right, thanks for watching. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of these shirts, because it supports this type of in-depth work directly, and it's purchases from our store that have made all of this possible over the years, where we can expand to buy these failed parts from people, spend the time analyzing them, and really try to refine our videos to get here. So grab one on the store. They are limited. They feature the special 15-year anniversary version of our logo right on the front with a foil gold, blue, and there's some green in there too for GPU substrates. And otherwise, subscribe for more, or you can support us for a few bucks on patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to help there instead. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time. ASUS is the motherboard for those who dare.
I've got nothing, it's totally froze again. Oh, there you go, there you go. I got this 0D error, and this has been a recurring issue with this board. When I went to run this, I got a blue screen of death. I blue screened again. Might be the beginning and the end of it if it just keeps crashing every time I run a CPU load.
The BIOS update really plainly spells out, hey, if something goes wrong because of our BIOS, fuck you and fuck your board. You gotta give it to them. It's pretty accurate branding. You have to be very daring to want to introduce that to your home or your computer. So Asus right now is acting either negligently or extremely maliciously, in our opinions, and that's because of its absolutely panicked BIOS updates and its mixed messages on warranty support, plus what it thinks of AMD Expo. So they're trying to resolve the self-immolating CPU problem, and if you missed that video, definitely go watch that before this one. It's a really cool video and kind of required information. But not only has Asus's newest BIOS not fixed the problems, it is acting in an extremely scummy and, we think, unethical way as it tries to slither out of any responsibility. Before that, this video is brought to you by Deepcool and the new Zero Dark series of AK620 and AK400 CPU coolers. We previously reviewed the AK620 and AK400 and found them to be among a new crop of extremely competitive coolers for the price. The new Zero Dark and Zero Dark Plus variations move out to a blackout color design with blackout FDB fans. The heatsinks otherwise have the same characteristics as those that we tested previously and found to be well performing, just with a fresh new look. Learn more at the link in the description below. First, Asus ships a BIOS that blasts SoC voltage and overshoots OCP in a way that degrades or just incinerates the chips. Next, Asus ships a BIOS update that requires you to agree to void your warranty if you install it to stop the CPUs from exploding from their first fault. And it's actually kind of brilliant, because it's the quickest way to avoid all long-term liabilities on their balance sheet. And none of that is to mention Asus's strong commitment to encourage users to just hit F5 and run defaults on their fancy $700 premium motherboards with their embedded controllers that do nothing useful at all, apparently, because they could stop these problems, but for some reason we're not using them the way that makes sense. So if that's the stupid game that we want to play, then we are happy to award Asus with the stupid prize for the stupid game. We retested it with defaults, no Expo, and it's not good.
Yeah, that's pretty disappointing, but let's see, give it one more go here.
So there's a couple parts to this video. One is a brief technical benchmark. One is looking at the VSOC changes. Another one is looking at Expo and Asus's slimy behavior regarding warranties, BIOS updates where they're retconning things and retroactively changing the support list and trying to sweep stuff under the rug. Definitely check out the first video that's linked below. Again, it was a really fun educational video for us also, and it gets you all the basics for why this is happening. So first of all, again, Asus has been posting all over the place about run defaults, so that's what we did. We did exactly what Asus wanted. It didn't go well. It did not start well. So some of the memory kits we have actually won't even hold stable in auto with this board until Expo is applied. We noticed these issues with some of the kits of memory and other boards as well. And so the reason is, without Expo, if the kit requires, we think, a higher VDIM, which is different from VSOC, and you're not using Expo, and the board is running an auto VDIM that's on the lower side, then it just straight up doesn't work. So actually, Asus, in this instance, running defaults means not running at all, which we guess is a great way to never have to warranty a product because it just doesn't work. If that's what they want people to do, then we need to provide benchmarks to show you what you're giving up if you actually do that, genuinely. Like, that's the whole point of this, is all the benchmarks we ran, and probably everyone else, involved Expo, because it is a big part of the CPUs on the platform, just like XMP is for Intel, but Expo is more proportionally beneficial from what we've seen for AMD than perhaps XMP is in some instances for Intel, and so it matters here. And if any of you in the audience are like, okay, fine, I'll turn Expo off, we want you to understand what you're giving up, because the benchmarks that we publish do not reflect that outcome. But before we go through those numbers, and before we talk about how Asus is being an unethical scumbag of a company, we need to first start with the VSOC changes, because we've got some simple objective facts for that. So originally we observed a VSOC set point of about 1.341 volts, sometimes 1.35 volts with Expo 1. Asus has two Expo profiles. One is Expo 1, one is Expo 2, and the Expo profiles, that they have one of those, is an Asus optimized one, and it doesn't actually mean that it's using the two different profiles that can be on the stick. There can be two Expo profiles on a stick, but that's not what Asus's Expo 1 and 2 mean. That would be too sensical. Instead, they have their own optimized one, With either of those, we're seeing a 1.341 to 1.35 set, but that resulted in a 1.39 volt to 1.42 volt voltage when probed at the actual MLCC caps or at the VSOC checkpoints on the board when using Expo. We tested that with a multimeter externally. As a reminder, again, that's not Expo's fault. That's ASUS's fault. Expo, the profiles, do not contain a VSOC set point. The board decides what to set. So the new BIOS version, which is 1410, the one that, we'll come back to this, voids the user's warranty to install, configures that to a 1.296 volt set, so about a 50 millivolt reduction from previously. This then results in a 1.3369 volt measurement at the socket with Expo 1 and a G-Skill kit that we have, and with Expo 2 we saw a 1.3381 volt result. With Corsair, we measured 1.34 volts. So for all of the panic and the much ado about BIOS in the last week, ASUS still couldn't get it right. It's still too high. AMD's official recommendation, or the cutoff now, is 1.3 volts, but the board vendors can still technically set whatever they want. So even though the AGISA update can lock down and start restricting the voltage, the problem is ASUS, their 1.3 number manifests itself as something like 1.34 volts. So it is still on the high side. By the way, 1.25 volts is fine for a lot of these kits that are on the market. So 1.3 is already kind of high, even if it landed there as the get or the outcome voltage. Because if you set, with this board, if you set Expo through the AMD overclocking menu, as we said previously, it will result in a lower VSOC. So AMD's menu is setting a more appropriate VSOC than ASUS's own super advanced fancy premium menu. But the difference is that VDDIO is incorrect when setting it through AMD's menu, which results in instability and blue screens, whereas ASUS's menu just blasts all the voltages, so no problems anymore with stability until it starts dying. And big problems with stability. That's not supposed to be like that. And this is where the scumbaggery begins. It's a new phrase, we're coining it now. ASUS's BIOS version 1410 is clearly marked as a beta BIOS, but in an instance like this one, people are panicking and they're going to update BIOS because that's what you should do. So beta and the disclaimers here, not really a fair thing to do with at least the way they wrote this disclaimer. This was posted as a rapid, panicked response on May 2nd. ASUS states these changes. 1. Update AGISA version to combo AM5 PI1007. 2. Support 48 or higher density memory modules. 3. SoC voltage for Ryzen 7000 series limited to a maximum of 1.30 to protect the CPU and motherboard. That's not true, as we just showed you. And they also said this. Please note that this is a beta BIOS version of the motherboard, which is still undergoing final testing before its official release. The UEFI, its firmware, and all content found on it are provided on an as-is or as-available basis. Did you see that phrasing? We've already baked in the option where they're like, oops, the BIOS is not our support page anymore, just like all the other ones we pulled, therefore, we're not supporting it. So if you've gone and installed it and you never look again because it's supposed to fix the issue because they told you it fixes the issue, and then they decide we're going to pull that BIOS, no longer supported. It doesn't count because it is not as available. ASUS does not give any warranties, they say, whether express or limited, as to the suitability, compatibility, or usability of the UEFI, its firmware, or any of its content, except as provided in the product warranty and to the maximum extent permitted by law. ASUS is not responsible for direct, special, incidental, or consequential damages resulting from using this beta BIOS. And that's not even to mention the fact that ASUS's BIOS was one of the first to be based on AGISA 1.0.0.7, but it's based on an internal test of the branch, and it wasn't meant to be public. It was an internal-only version of the BIOS. That's why it says beta everywhere. They weren't supposed to release it. ASUS, that's not how any of this works. You don't ship a product that kills other products which are attached to it and then ship an update that says, oopsie, now it won't kill the things that it attaches to anymore or itself, and it's resolved, but also if you install this, you omit or forego your warranty. It's like it puts them in a better situation than if you just let the board kill the part with the original BIOS that was sold to you from Amazon or whatever. which we have some notes on that, by the way, too. Now, realistically, none of this actually gets upheld, and you could probably fight it as a consumer, and they would likely buckle because this is insane. Asus here is doing something very dangerous for Asus. What's the buzzword that they like internally? The brand credibility is suffering, something that Asus builds its brand on, where actually saw a Reddit comment the other day where someone said, "I'm glad I bought ASRock," which is like, Asus, that's a really bad place to be. So Asus is demonstrating a complete lack of confidence here because they feel the need to make a legal CYA statement on something that itself is already a legal CYA statement. It's like a recursive cover your ass statement. Does the coverage get better, or does it start looping back around and become like the human lawyer peed or something? So this shows that Asus recognizes it's rushing out firmware updates in dangerous ways. Firmware is one of the few things that has the power to just actually destroy parts if configured improperly, as we've already seen. That's not good. So if we clear CMOS...
You killed it the wrong way.
And Asus clearly hasn't tested what it's putting out because it doesn't have the confidence to warrant what it's putting out. It's irresponsible for Asus to even leave this BIOS live if they truly believe that it is such a risk. Either take away the no warranty disclaimer or take away the BIOS. Anything short of that is just, well, it's either panicked or it's conniving. And if it's panicked, then I don't want to be in a room with anyone from Asus when there's an emergency, because they're gonna panic. Now we get to the next part, which is Asus seems to think that all users should just disable Expo. Once again, and I keep coming back to the point because it's so crazy, and buy $500, $600, $700 motherboards that are far more expensive than they used to be, with a lot of features that aren't being leveraged properly, and then not use those features anyway because it would void the warranties and run at default. So we are happy to stop using Expo in our reviews then, to align with this new customer expectation. If the expectation from Asus, and we would expect AMD, is no one should use Expo, then we stop using Expo. What we're about to show you here in benchmarks is a glimpse of that outcome. The problem we had with it was the digging heels in publicly in a big way on the no warranty provided. So we'll do it Asus's way. We're retesting the 7000 series, the 7700X specifically, without Expo, and it's gonna hurt AMD way more than it hurts Intel when XMP is disabled. And by the way, we tested Intel's XMP impact on the warranty process years ago at this point. Try to remember to link it below. And we couldn't get them to not honor the warranty even with XMP enabled. But the clear difference here is the repeated statements to stop using it and that it's overclocking. First one, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p had the 7700X originally at 292 FPS average in the Asus board, but because the intended use for this $340 CPU and a $700 motherboard is actually stock settings, we followed Asus's advice and it fell to 252 FPS. So, enabling the that's illegal setting of Expo gives 16% more performance, but don't do that because it's not allowed. Likewise, 1% and 0.1% lows fell in step with the average. The 7700X is now actually worse than a 13600K, so by Asus's own guidance, you should literally never buy a 7700X. We're sure AMD will appreciate Asus's help with its marketing. In Cyberpunk, the 7700X's original 231 FPS average result is now invalid. Instead, we fall to 196 FPS. That means that Expo was worth 18%, or enough to move the CPU from impressive mediocrity, hardly better than a 12100F, into being actually worth considering. The lows also fell with this change. With these new numbers, it becomes clear that an Asus plus AMD combination is the last platform you should buy, and that's on their own recommendation. In Final Fantasy XIV, we lost 30 FPS off the top of the performance and averages, and not far from that in lows. The 7700X therefore falls to 201 FPS, which has it only 7% better than a 12100F. Knowing this, you should buy the 12100F instead. It's $240 cheaper than the $340 7700X, and the difference is 7%. So, once again, we're glad Asus could clear that up for us, because that saves a lot of people a lot of money. They're actually being very altruistic here. one last one. In Far Cry 6, the 7700X fell from 171 FPS to 150, allowing the 13600A to completely trash the CPU in price and performance. Asus is spearheading the best marketing campaign Intel has had in years. Remember, it's for those who dare. So here's the deal. The whole malicious compliance with Asus's request thing, it's absurd. This entire thing we're doing right now, all of it is absurd because it's basically a parody. And it's a glimpse into, once again, if Asus is going to say absurd things, then we will happily do those absurd things to prove a point. That's what this video is. So now we get into the next part. We are consistent with a statement of you shouldn't just trust a company to cover you. And if Asus makes repeated explicit statements that it will not cover you in some of these scenarios, like the BIOS update really plainly spells out, hey, if something goes wrong because of our BIOS, fuck you and fuck your board. They really make it clear. So Expo results in you apparently being cast aside at the first sign of trouble, and we believe them in that. It's not just some legalese on the box somewhere as a CYA like AMD's or Intel's statements about quote-unquote overclocking. It's the repeated, clear, explicit language that makes us trust Asus to screw us. But that's not the only place Asus had been scummy in the last week. We've received a lot of outreach from users, and a lot of that outreach include screenshots, logs, forwarded emails, and chats with Asus customer support, and frankly, we're kind of horrified at the level of support that Asus is providing. This isn't just the Expo thing. Like, we've been getting these for a couple months now. We've noticed the increase in volume, and we were actually starting to work towards a content piece, and then it fell in our laps. So, first of all, when Asus found out that we were buying their failed parts from users on the internet, our understanding is that they then went and effectively, our interpretation, tried to bribe those users by offering them not only the replacement of the dead part, but also something else that they wanted from the Asus catalog. Maybe that's a divine gesture from Asus to give back to those who dared to have their motherboard blow up. But our problem with it is that in the chat logs we've seen from users who hadn't expressed that we were there to then scoop up the parts, Asus didn't make the same offers. So it starts to look like they're trying to prevent independent outlets from getting a hold of these things, which obviously too late, we published that piece now, and trying to resolve it and sweep it under the rug. And yeah, it's a nice gesture to offer the users anything they want in return for the part when they know it's going to an independent outlet, but it is pretty, I mean, it reeks of an ulterior motive, and we just don't like it. It's that simple. So keeping the information out of the public eye, these companies like to offer a nebulous fix and then just go silent, never say anything again. Now, if you didn't notice, at the first sign of a failure publicly, this was before we started working on it, Asus immediately pulled all of its older BIOS updates. The page was constantly in flux with small and large tweaks alike as the company panicked and went into full limitation of liability mode after a major fuck up with their OCP in combination with overvoltage. We also noticed that they were even retroactively changing their own updates to intentionally manipulate whether the BIOSes listed supported the X3D CPUs. So they'd post a BIOS revision with one set of notes, then retcon those notes quietly while also removing evidence of other prior BIOS versions, thus implying that users who installed the BIOS based on those notes are now out of compliance and warranty. Asus has more warranty reversal engineers at this point than apparently actual electrical engineers who worked on the products. They're spending a lot of time trying to find ways to screw people out of a warranty. By the way, I think we've made it clear we don't do the just trust Asus thing, because that's why the written policies are there. It's the whole point. Now, fortunately, we have every BIOS Asus has ever released for these boards saved, because it's the one we use for our testing, and we're reconsidering that now. But here are some notables. BIOS version 0402 shipped on our new in-box board we just bought this past week, which is from actually that BIOS from last year, before the reviewer BIOS, from what we could see. It didn't look like it was ever even a public release. BIOS version 0922 technically didn't support the X3D CPUs, but it was the last one right before their launch, and it had vCore enabled, by the way, for X3D. BIOS version 1101 was one of the first public BIOSes to support X3D CPUs. BIOS version 1202 was the only one ASUS left alive during the test of the initial X3D blowouts in our testing last week. And while we were setting up our platform for validation, we noticed ASUS made even more changes to its website. Gems like this one stand out, where ASUS claims to support the 7000 X6D processors. Personally, I can't wait to get the new 6-dimensional 7000 series processor, because not only does the cache scale vertically, but it also scales across time, space, collective consciousness, and the astral plane. Truly revolutionary. ASUS's spiritual, spatial, and existential panic aside, they then updated the page again to list a new line item. Number 4, thermal monitoring mechanisms to help protect the CPU and motherboard. Also, the older BIOSes with manual vCore control were removed. We also found it incredibly shady when ASUS retconned the supported since a BIOS column on this page. It changed the support list from 1101, which was supported, to 1202. Now, to be fair, lies have to be intentional, but the line says validated since. It was validated since 1101, and just quietly retconning all of these things gaslights users into actually not being sure what they have anymore, what they've ever used in terms of what was supported with the CPUs and the boards, which is maybe the point. This shows it's either extremely, it's multiple things. It's extremely disorganized, is misleading, it is shady and slimy, and this is not the way a brand that prides itself on being premium should be acting if it wants to sell a $700 motherboard. And to be clear, taking down old BIOSes in and of itself isn't shady or slimy. Just disable a button and post a note with them that says they have a bug. Same with the CPU support table. Make a note, say why it changed and what it used to be, with maybe a strike through rather than gaslighting the users. Say that the early support for these was bugged in the older version and might destroy your CPU. So it at least helps someone to know what happened and if they should upgrade. And then just list the current version for support. ASUS also posted this statement on its Facebook page, preempting AMD's own statement originally and our initial video. Quote, several AMD Ryzen 7000 X3D owners have reported CPU and motherboard failures. Ryzen 7000 X3D processors do not allow for CPU ratio or CPU core voltage tuning. Quick interruption, they actually then parenthetically define this as overclocking. Close enough. But actually they did. So originally, if you bought a board off Amazon and it had not the exact correct BIOS from ASUS at the time, and you put an X3D CPU in there, it will allow overvolting. Ask me how I know. When you get the purple numbers, it's good. They say, but they do allow for performance tuning and DRAM overclocking via PBO2 and Expo memory. To support Expo and or memory overclocking, DDR5 6000 and beyond, SoC voltage has to be sufficiently increased to ensure compatibility and stability. The amount of voltage required varies between CPU samples. Some processors are more sensitive to overvoltage than others, and some are capable of running at higher memory frequencies without needing as much voltage. As confirmed with AMD, any intentional manipulation of these settings can damage the processor, socket, and motherboard. Now, just to be clear, that line was intentional manipulation of these settings. It's an important line. So this is actually insane, because no reasonable user will expect that a heavily marketed and relied upon feature being turned on is intentional manipulation of a setting that will cause the CPU to explode. That is not a reasonable thing to say from ASUS. The easiest example is if you get into your car and it has a sport mode, and you switch it to sport mode, and then the car explodes. No middle step. You turn it to sport mode, and kaboom. It's not like you're modding the computer in the car and you're unlocking things that are inherently locked down that you need to then go and manually turn off. This isn't actually real overclocking, even if we want to interpret it this way. And this is where it comes down to a scenario of death of the author. If you're not familiar with the phrase, death of the author suggests that as an author puts out a published work, if the public then interprets that author's meaning in a different way than the author had intended, it sort of becomes irrelevant what the author had intended. And in this scenario, what matters is that no reasonable user thinks Expo. First of all, Expo doesn't change VSOC. That's the motherboard vendor doing that. They are correct that higher VSOC than 1.0, which is default, is required to get stability, but not necessarily 1.35 or whatever they want to set. But either way, a reasonable user will not expect that Expo On, which is heavily marketed, advertised, and relied upon in AMD's first-party benchmarks and ASUS's, will then kill the product. Not only that, but AMD explicitly went on record with us to state that if your CPU dies from this failure, which is inclusive, by the way, to Expo, it is in fact covered under their warranty. They will replace the CPU. They told us that directly. They'll even pay for shipping, like your car. It's absolutely warranted if you turn on sport mode and it explodes. All of this posturing is totally unnecessary, and it's what has us so frustrated. It is, bringing it back, therefore not reasonable for ASUS to accuse the user of intentionally manipulating a setting which is not being intentionally changed. ASUS is the only one that is intentionally manipulating VSOC here. It's their setting to change with that profile. Now, we emailed ASUS to ask about the statement. Here's what we said. The short version is that we wanted to know specifically what ASUS meant when it said intentional manipulation. When ASUS gave us its intentionally manipulative response, it said this, quote, "Thanks for reaching out. The update we released was an in-progress statement we wanted to provide to the community and partners alongside coordination with AMD PR. Let's find the closest bus and drag them under it. The wording you refer to is from an NDA, or non-disclosure agreement, AMD guidance advisory concerning voltage, as noted in our statement, as confirmed with AMD. Please reach out to AMD for additional clarification in this respect. The new UEFI builds with a new maximum available SoC voltage limit of 1.3 have been pushed out and are available to download on our service and support website." First of all, so that was sent to us before the new 1410 version was released, and the BIOS that was available at the time that we got that email did not stop at 1.3 volts. It was still really high. So that was actually just objectively not true. So that's quick to move on from. This is a nice catch-22 otherwise, because they're basically saying AMD briefed us under NDA. Ask AMD what that detail was. And by the way, we, ASUS, are breaching our NDA by telling you we were under NDA for these details. So we did reach out to AMD. We sent them the thread and said, hey, why don't we all just be aware of what one party's saying of the other? And while we did not receive an official answer, our understanding is that ASUS's statement was posted of their own volition and independently. So we thought it was interesting that this is how they handled it. ASUS here is avoiding any responsibility, and that's the sad part, because ASUS is a brand that has the brand presence and power and money to come out and turn this into a massive marketing win. All they had to do was come out and say, look, get it, we've seen that some of these parts are dying in our boards, and we don't expect that they should die, but if they do, here's what we're doing. Step one, we're updating BIOS. You'll want to grab that as soon as we're done panicking, running around headlessly, and uploading a bunch of shit to our website that might break your stuff. Grab the next BIOS that's actually good. And step two, if a part does die, in writing right now, we are committing to replacing those parts if they die in this fashion. That's all they really had to do here. A huge win. And this video wouldn't really need to exist. It'd be about probably Gigabyte or ASRock instead. It's not even the main concern. I mean, obviously, our main concern now is ASUS has eroded any and all trust that it had accumulated up until this point, and it needs to earn it back. And secondarily, this whole warranty thing about you all know how we feel about these types of statements. They are not just saying trust us, they're saying the opposite. They're explicitly saying if you use this BIOS, we're not supporting you, but also you need to use this BIOS. And by the time this video goes up, there's going to be another BIOS. So maybe they changed the tune, but they've kind of shown their colors at this point. We have plenty of other complaints. I mean, Armory Crate is still baked into the motherboard, so that's your day zero exploit waiting to happen in the future. XMP 1 and 2 and Expo 1 and 2 don't mean the first and second profiles on the stick, which is the only thing they should ever mean. They also now have another option called the Expo Tweaked, because apparently the first two weren't enough. And again, there was the VDDIO issue. So, you know, this video, the tone, obviously, the first one was very objectively focused on let's find the problem. But seeing the response to the problem, it becomes more of a social issue and less of a technical one. And that's why it becomes more hyperbolic in the reporting, because we're in a scenario where these are absurdist responses from ASUS, and they deserve an absurdist response from the media to hopefully show them, hey, you are being absurd. Why are you being absurd? So, 1410 didn't fix the issues entirely. They lowered the VSOC, yes. There's still issues present. And I'm concerned about Asus's level of support, but we're looking into that too. So, check back for that sometime in the future. Hopefully you enjoyed the rant, but we'll see if it does anything. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab a shirt like this one to support us directly and our rants. And we'll see you all next time. In the news this week, we'll be talking about the RTX 4090 Dragon. It's actually out now. It's official. We'll also be going over a rumor of a 700-watt NVIDIA GPU. It's like we're going back in time a few years. That definitely was already a rumor at one point, but it's back. It's kind of different this time. And we'll be talking about Starforge with a response to our pre-built review. It's actually pretty good. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the Frozen A620 series air coolers. The Frozen A620 coolers use a dual tower, dual fan design and come in both ARGB and non-RGB variants. ID Cooling has remained largely value focused while keeping performance as good as possible for the price. This is something we talked about with the 216 previously. Check out the A620 for a dual tower cooler for your mid-range gaming PCs at the link in the description below. First up, the Disappointment build is live. It's our annual build video. A lot of fun. It's a way for us to explore some of the creative side, but also just recalibrate, look at the craziness of the past year. And if you didn't see it, you should definitely check it out because it included some of the best memeable quotes from all of the executives from 2023. As an example.
So kids, Papa's here.
Yes, he actually said that. And then there was this one too.
Who's looking forward to Starfield?
Which apparently got Most Innovative Game of the Year from the Steam Awards. And from what I understand, that was a meme thanks to Reddit, but it didn't stop Starfield from promoting it on their Twitter page. So good job, Reddit. Your memes became reality. Anyway, that video's up. We really enjoyed working on it. It's a horror-themed intro, basically, where the computer parts are all possessed and taking over the office. We do that every year. We've done it since 2017 now. The 2017 one was actually possessed by a Vega GPU. That one was a lot of fun as well. Way different editing style. And with that, we also launched our brand new and annual limited Disappointment shirts. I have one on right now. These directly fund all of our testing, equipment purchases, review product purchases going into 2024. And you can see the funding we raised with the shirt from last year in play in our hemi-anechoic chamber that we just recently used again in our Starforge PC review, if you want to see an example of where the money ends up going when we sell these. These have been selling crazy fast as always, and we're actually already out of one of the sizes in cotton, so if you want one, make sure to grab one as soon as you can on store.gamersnexus.net, because we will not be making another round of these. They're already in stock, and they're already shipping basically immediately when you order. The Disappointment shirt features an exploded diagram of a memory module on the front and a memory architecture layout on the back. The spine is decorated with a representation of computer memory, and the flanking dates list all the most disappointing hardware industry events of the year. And thankfully, snake oil snuck in right at the end. So thanks, Intel.
Thanks, Steve.
That was literally, so I was working on the shirt design, and we were in San Francisco when I was finalizing that design, which is where we filmed the snake oil video. And I sent the design, and right when I hit send, I saw the news pop up about Intel's crazy snake oil slide deck, and I hit unsend immediately. I was like, this needs to go on the shirt, and it did. So it made it in, and it made it into the video, the Disappointment intro, which we have Wendell to thank for the art on our snake oil bottle here. It's one of one. I really should get him to sign it next time. Anyway, we sincerely appreciate the support from all of you who bought the shirt this year, all the prior years. We received a lot of messages from a lot of you in the audience who've been collecting these over a few years now, so thank you for doing that. And I wanted to express our sincere gratitude as a team because the funding boost sets us up pretty well for testing and, again, review hardware purchases. I just placed a bunch of orders for pre-built, some GPUs, and a couple of other things that we're going to be reviewing over the next month or so. And that is all funded directly by the shirt purchases. So you can grab one on store.gamersnexus.net. They're available in cotton, 100% cotton, or in a heather charcoal design if you'd like one of those. And we still have all sizes covered between the two options, but we ran out of one of the sizes already in cotton, and we're going to be running out of all of them within probably the next 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the pacing. So anyway, let's get into the news. The first one is the RTX 4090D, which has been called the Dragon Edition. That's because it is a China exclusive launch. The 4090D is now an official card. It's been covered in the sort of rumor mill for a month or so now on and off. And this is compliant with the US sanctions on the total processing power, making it capable of being shipped into China and sold there. NVIDIA's official specs page lists the card as costing 13,000 renminbi, or about $1,831 US. It still has 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X VRAM, so that's the same, but it cuts down the CUDA core count to 14,592 cores from 16,384 on the normal 4090 non-D. So that reduction is about 11%. Traditionally, this type of change might warrant a 4080 Ti, but rumors point toward a 4080 Super already being on NVIDIA's list for the next major launch globally. The other big change on the spec sheet is the power target. The original 4090 has a power target of 450 watts, with the 4090D at 425 watts. We'd wager that the 4090D may lack any significant overclocking support to help it further comply, but presently we don't have one to confirm. And additionally, we don't know if they've done any extra tweaking to help it further comply. So as an example, we don't know if they've changed the tensor cores from what you'd normally see for that SM count. And that's something that'll just have to be confirmed once some of the first people get them. All right, next one. This is really short. It's the shortest story we have this week. It's a rumor of a 700-watt NVIDIA card codenamed Skinny Joe, and the leaker Harukaze5719 spotted the card, posted a tweet, and showed it being added to a support list via a forum update. So there's no more information right now. We've seen some speculation on it being a data center card at 700 watts. That would probably make sense. Feasibly, it could maybe be a 4090 Ti or something, but it's entirely speculation. We know nothing beyond the tweet, so it might exist. Let's move on. Our next story is a follow-up to our StarForge pre-built review. If you didn't see it, we reviewed the Horizon 2 Ultra. It's a pre-built machine from StarForge. Our main complaints were criticisms of screw torque, where they had a number of loose screws. I think it ended up counting, we didn't give a final count in the video, but I think it was like 5 or 6 or something depending on how you count the side panel. So it was a lot, and it was enough to not just be a mistake. It's like there is clearly a process issue here. And then they also had the peel, the protective peel on the thermal pad for the SSD heatsink on the motherboard applied to the SSD, which isn't great. Fortunately, and we said this in the review, that the peel, the protective peel on the thermal pad for the SSD heatsink on the motherboard applied to the SSD, which isn't great. Fortunately, and we said this in the review, that SSD is not hot enough. It didn't affect the performance. The steady state temperature is more or less the same, and that's just because it's not fast enough. And so they skated by with it. But it was one of those, okay, this really needs to be removed. It's a process control issue. If they start using stuff where it matters more, or they skip other steps, that could lead to issues. So those were our concerns with the system, but overall we were relatively positive on it. And as far as pre-built reviews go, if it's a weighted scale, we were extremely positive on it compared to some of the others. So StarForge emailed us to inform us of some changes they're making as a result of the review. The company stated that it has identified a shortcoming in its process, specifically for the screws, for how it's handling installing hardware, and it was a difference in where manual versus powered screwdrivers were being used by the build teams. And different people were using different approaches to it, and most of you probably know this, but an incorrect torque setting on a powered driver, whether it's a drill or just an electric screwdriver, means it'll stop spinning, obviously, before it's actually fully properly seated. And likewise, using an electric screwdriver that's too weak, like some of the cheaper ones you can get on Amazon or something, they never quite have that torque to really cinch it down at the last couple turns. So those are some of the process differences. StarForge noted the following in its email to us. It said, quote, "In identifying this, we have outlined 2 key changes that will help to support better accuracy and attention to detail in the future. 1, the build team leaders are instituting a quarterly workshop to reiterate our prep and assembly processes with the team, as well as ensure hands-on time with each team member in order to identify areas for improvement. They said our goal with this program is to provide a knowledge refresh to team members, as well as create an opportunity for continual training and maintenance. Point 2, in addition to the quarterly training and knowledge refresh workshop, our team will also be expanding the scope of our internal QC to add a monthly random build audit for each builder. The goal here is not to create an antagonistic program that passes down punishment for errors, but rather simply identifies areas for improvement and provides another opportunity for our managers to work with their team at a mentorship level and ensure habits are corrected where necessary. Along with this, we are implementing an incentive program that rewards consistent top scores on these spot checks. In addition, we'll also implement an incentive that encourages improvement, providing compensation for consistently correcting assembly errors caught in our prior audits. Once again, our team deeply appreciated your honest feedback on our product, and we're hopeful that these changes will help to further elevate our customers' experience with StarForge. Generally speaking then, StarForge management was extremely professional in its receipt of the criticism and responding so quickly with a plan of action. They responded, so basically within 5 or 6 hours of the review going live, we had an email in our inbox with this, saying here's what we've identified, here's how we're fixing it. That's great to see. So this is what we kind of wanted to see as a response, because the issue seemed like it was more of just tightening up the processes and defining it for the team, and it looks like that's what they're doing. And we've seen this response a few times over the years from SI. So iWayPower, as an example, years ago wrote a similar big QC overhaul that they told us they were doing as a result of one of our reviews. And then SkyTech, previously after the last one, where they had the backwards fans facing, like opposing fans on the heatsink, they had some process improvements as well. But Origin actually also had plans to improve its processes after our review, where they had the 5800X3D or whatever it was failing to hit the spec in that system. So anyway, it's good to see when a company immediately finds out what caused the issue, puts a plan in place, and it's especially true with pre-builds where so much can differ from one builder to the next in the same company. So Starforge also had this nice message at the end of its email where it said, once again, from the whole team, we really appreciate you all putting together such a thorough review here. While we are internally committed to continuous improvement, I cannot stress enough how much it helps to have a respected third party assess your product and provide their honest feedback. So that's good. Sounds like the attention to detail elements might be addressed. We'll be checking back in on them periodically, just like we do for all the other pre-built reviews. And so we might look at them again this year sometime once they've had enough time to make those changes, and we can do another spot check undercover. Before then, though, we have an upcoming tour of the facility, and it's part of a bigger story that we're excited about. That'll be coming out sometime in the next weeks to month. They didn't know we were working on the review at the time we toured, and it was really hard for me to keep my mouth shut when we were looking at stuff, talking to them, because I was like, I have thoughts on this because I've already worked on a computer, but we didn't say anything. Anyway, that'll be coming up later. Okay, next one, new leaks of AMD's 8000 series desktop APU. These are some of the Phoenix APUs that are coming out, and there's the socketable ones. So this past week, the two primary leaks indicated a Ryzen 7 8700G and a Ryzen 5 8600G. These have been picked up by a lot of places, but Notebook Check has some Geekbench listings screenshotted. The 8700G is an 8-core, 16-thread part with 12 CUs on a Radeon 780M IGP, according to Geekbench. The listing presents a 4.2 gigahertz base frequency, 16 megabytes of L3, and a score of 29,244 for OpenCL, or 35,000 for Vulkan performance. Meanwhile, the 8600G leak indicates a 6-core, 12-thread APU with Radeon 760M graphics embedded with base at 4.35 gigahertz. The CES is next week, and AMD almost certainly has announcements there along with everyone else, so we'll probably hear more then. We'd expect to get more news on those. Aya Neo and GPD handhelds, these are kind of fun. So handheld gaming brands Aya Neo and GPD have both announced that they will be using the new AMD 8000 series solutions, and they claim to be the first handhelds that are using them. Aya Neo is relatively new. Aya Neo Flip is known to have the 8840U APU to power its dual screen handheld device. Checking the AMD spec pages, the 8840U is functionally the same as the 7840U for use cases the Aya Neo device might see. They're both 8-core, 16-thread CPUs, boosting up to 5.1 gigahertz and with a 3.3 gigahertz base, and they both have 12 CUs at 2700 megahertz. The difference is in the TOPS performance for the AI engine, where the 8840U gets a big uplift, but this seems probably irrelevant for most potential buyers of the handhelds. The handheld itself is pretty interesting on its own, though. The Aya Neo Flip DS is clearly meant to be a Nintendo DS follow-up. It has a dual-stick layout with a somewhat standard set of face button options, and it's got the two screens. The GPD also noted that it's launching an 8840U-based Win Mini device. Up next, we've been talking about the 3050 6GB refresh for a while now. It's basically a 3050. It's got some reductions, like in VRAM, 2 gigabytes down. But there's a new one that's a fanless solution that was spotted by video cards, and this one's kind of interesting. So this 3050 6GB from Palit, again spotted by video cards, is mostly interesting not for the GPU, but because passive cards are extremely useful and utilitarian and still somewhat rare at any reasonable performance level. We use them internally all the time for our acoustic chamber. Focusing on this one image from video cards, we can see the fins are oriented top to bottom, but with the bottom fully closed off. This type of card would do a lot better in an inverted build where you get the heatsink facing up. The lack of any forced airflow means it'll rely on natural processes, and this is where heat rising actually does start to matter for passively cooled systems. Up next, an AMD skateboard, sort of. It'd be cooler if it were a full-sized skate deck, but it's a USB key. Good enough. And it's a fingerboard, maybe with working wheels. Lenovo and AMD released an officially cross-branded USB key finger skateboard.
IT Home says that the drive maxes out at 400 megabytes per second read and 300 write. The housing is aluminum, and the drive rotates out to reveal a Type A and Type C connector. Definitely would block a lot of ports, but it's a novelty. We don't have one to confirm, but it does look like the wheels actually spin, and this joins an existing fingerboard from Lenovo with the Xiaoxing written across the top. Without seeing the characters written, I'm not 100% sure, but Xiaoxing commonly means careful or be careful, which maybe makes sense. Next one, JS is releasing a translucent docking station for the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally, and a couple other devices from Ioneo. JS has seen crazy success from its translucent shells for the Steam Deck, which are full swap shells, and the dock rests the device at an angle, and it allows it to connect for charging. The specs include USB-C in with output to gigabit Ethernet, USB 2.0 Type A, to USB Type A 3.0 at 5 gigabits per second, and USB-C at 5 gigabits per second with another USB-C connector. And JS recommends a 100-watt charger for the ROG Ally to ensure sufficient power for a 30-watt mode and all other I/O options. Cost is pretty high. The one model is $70, and then the other is $100 with a TF slot, 3.5mm audio interface, SD card slot, and some other extras. The last one we spotted on Tom's Hardware, and it's just kind of fun. This is a Kickstarter project by Jason Rogers that shows off a retro gaming watch, as it's called. The campaign video makes references to other fun retro watch designs of ages past. The watch claims to use hardware-assisted rendering and emulation, noting use of an FPGA, an ARM Cortex M33, and promising capabilities to, quote, easily handle just about any DOS-era game. The watch also connects to smartphones and behaves as a typical smartwatch. The creator notes that looking cool was high on the priorities list, behind being functional. He has videos embedded in the campaign page that show Metroid 2 and Stunt FX running on an FPGA board, and developmental photos of the PCB iterations. From the Kickstarter post, it sounds like the main challenge has been getting the size under control so that it's usable for gaming when dismounted from the wrist, but also a normal size watch when on the wrist. The Kickstarters always have risk attached to them, so we're not sure where this will end up, but it's a cool concept and the shell has a good look to it. So that's it for this roundup. Thanks for watching. As always, we'll have a ton of news next week. There'll probably be a few episodes because CES, so likely there'll be announcements from at least the big silicon makers, and then probably some roundups of some of the other stuff at the show. But check back for all that. You can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab a shirt like this one. And thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.
Hardware RAID is dead. Okay, you might not have gotten the memo about that, so you should for sure check out my other video if you didn't see that. Today's more about, okay, if it isn't dead, it's certainly got to be on life support, right? And saying it's... There's no end of high-end hardware, and maybe high-end thinking here at Level 1. I'll tell you right now, hardware RAID is basically dead for the high-end, high-speed, 64 cores of awesome goodness. Support for it has gone away at a hardware level a long time ago. And so what the very definition of RAID means has evolved and changed somewhat. Probably not for the better. And if you expect RAID to help prevent data corruption, you've missed the boat on what RAID has become. In the past, RAID meant that you had both physical device redundancy in case of failure and the ability to detect and correct data errors, even errors not reported by the drives themselves. Correcting errors, bit rot, is important, make no mistake. But almost all modern hardware and software RAID solutions rely on the drives themselves to honestly report errors. That means many of the types of RAID arrays, especially hardware assist or pure hardware RAID arrays, do not actually verify the data that they are giving you is the same data that you originally gave them for storage. And that is madness, because it can be an opportunity for bit rot to set in. Now, some things, I think, that should not have been forgotten were lost. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. RAID! So what got this started was I got a chance to play with Supreme RAID S.i.R 1000. For me, the marketing of that thing evokes a sense of yesteryear when software RAID was really bad, slow, and unreliable, and hardware RAID cards were just magical. They went with mechanical hard drives and they abstracted away all the complexity and everything just worked, and they handled errors really well. The G-RAID 1000 is a card that promises to offload parity calculations, and it does perform impressively. I like what it promises to do, but I don't like the implementation. You gotta go fast, but if you're gonna go fast, you gotta understand the dangers that you're getting yourself into. And bit rot is not one of the use cases this thing covers. The promise here is if you have an array of multiple NVMe drives, you could give up the capacity of one or two of them for redundancy. That way any one of them can fail and things will keep right on working. Now it does support RAID 0 and RAID 1. Both of those offer just speed, and RAID 1 will do mirroring, but there's no parity calculation involved in that. It's just mirroring, so it's not really offloading a lot in that case. What's interesting is parity calculations around RAID 5 and RAID 6. Well, how it's implemented is with a not super modified NVIDIA GPU, the NVIDIA T1000. Theoretically, that does any RAID calculations, RAID parity calculations, rather than the CPU. But this is a PCI Express 3.0 by 16 card, and that means that the absolute maximum that it can format is 16 gigabytes per second. It's the max bandwidth of a PCI Express 3.0 by 16 card. 16 gigabytes per second, and yet in their press release, they're talking about 100 gigabytes per second in the reads. That seems very fast. If the PCIe bandwidth is 16 gigabytes per second, but you can read at 100 gigabytes per second plus, how does it verify that the data it's returning to you is the data that you gave it? The data that it's returning matches the checksum and parity that's theoretically stored somewhere. Well, there are no connections on the card, it's just a PCIe card, so it's gonna happen over the PCIe bus, right? Nope, turns out it doesn't happen at all. It doesn't verify crap. I checked it by injecting a tiny bit of corruption, and it doesn't detect it. Their website says, G-RAID, Supreme RAID shoulders all the I.O. processing and RAID computation burden. The first part can't be true, because there's not physically enough I.O. bandwidth to carry all of the I.O. data to the array. It's just the parity data. You're gonna max out at 16 gigabytes per second. It doesn't do that. It's obviously not doing that if the array can be faster than the physical interface of the card. So the explanation is that it doesn't check for parity unless a drive is totally missing or an NVMe drive itself actually reports the error. This is maybe a little disturbing because a lot of IT pros still have the expectation that hardware RAID controllers, especially ones that build themselves as enterprise class, can detect and correct errors on the fly, not just handle the case that the whole drive has gone offline or that a drive is reporting an error. This thing, the G-RAID 1000, it cannot detect silent corruption type of errors to save its life. Search the manual for verify or patrol or integrity or consistency or scrub. It doesn't have a way to initiate a scrub from the user side of things. I'm told they're working on that, but there's nothing in the manual that indicates that it could scan a volume for inconsistencies. And the website also mocks the RAID 5 write hole. It says, and to maintain data integrity of the cache in the event of a power loss, a battery backup is also required. The card will suffer a huge performance drop if it fills up. If the battery is exhausted or the module's full, we'll need to switch to write-through mode in order to preserve data integrity. Well, guess what? G-RAID 1000, it's got to be a little careful there throwing stones because it's a device that also lives in a glass house. So instead, it looks to me like, in the case of the RAID 5 write hole, this card is just keeping performance high by casting your data into the void in scenarios where the RAID 5 write hole might affect you. Because I can easily introduce corruption, and in order to detect corruption, it's going to do a full rescan. We did it, team! Woo! But I'm picking on G-RAID, when really this also affects a lot of enterprise solutions. Even Linux MD RAID, it actually has the partial parity log, which helps close the RAID 5 write hole and keep the array consistent. But even if these folks did that, there would be extra writes, which is a cause of a loss of performance. So Linux MD is a little safer in that regard, but Linux MD also doesn't verify the parity, except and unless a drive reports an error, a drive self-reports an error. So the marketers would gaslight you into believing this was always the case and that no RAID has ever been responsible for bit rot and silent corruption. But come with me, step back in time for just a moment. We're going to take a look at old school RAID. Our story starts really in the 1980s, but we can fast forward a bit until 2002. Enterprise RAID 5 in 2002 would absolutely detect silent corruption and correct silent corruption, and then use the parity data to figure out what was wrong in enterprise storage. So what makes RAID 5 work better in 2002 than 2022? Well, let's think through it. If you had 5 drives in a RAID 5 and you fetched 4 chunks of data and 1 chunk of parity from those drives, but the parity is inconsistent, who's lying? Which drive is lying to you? How do you know which one's inconsistent? Is it a block of data that's wrong, or is it the parity that's wrong? The answer in 2002 was that there was more information than just the parity. You see, the sector size of the hard drives were also larger, 8 bytes larger. Now, let's go aside for a second and talk about sector size. A sector is the smallest parcel of info that a drive will work with. Going back more than 30 years, hard drives could operate in one of 2 modes, formatted with 512-byte sectors or formatted with 520-byte sectors. You can't just write 1 byte on a hard drive, you see. It's done a sector at a time. Now, it is true that some hard drives might not support 520-byte sectors, but you better believe that an enterprise-grade hard drive could absolutely support a 520-byte sector for these reasons. The RAID controller itself would store a checksum of the 512 bytes of data in the sector and the extra 8 byte. So you have 512 bytes of data and then a checksum that goes in the last 8 bytes, and the RAID controller was responsible for that. So when you created a RAID array, the hardware RAID controller would create that on a 520 byte volume of 520 byte drives, but then would present it as a 512 byte volume to the operating system, because most operating systems don't know how to handle anything except 512 byte sectors. Now, 8 bytes, that's not enough for error correction, but in our same 5 drive, RAID 5 example, the controller has extra bytes every sector on every drive to see which drive is lying. It doesn't rely on the drive to tell it that it's lying. The other reason it worked like this is performance. If you stored 512 bytes in one place and then the extra checksum somewhere else, that's 2 mechanical hard drive seeks, and hard drive seeks are measured in milliseconds. That's just too much overhead. Making the sector a little larger, from 512 bytes to 520 bytes, was much less of a performance impact on the read operation. You could also use a really complicated parity algorithm with parity blocks, where the parity and the data blocks are much larger than the sector size, usually to the tune of a half a megabyte, something like that. But you get a lot of overhead with bigger sectors. It's not great for performance. It's computationally kind of expensive to work with blocks that big. So why not 520 byte sectors today? Well, drive vendors charged a lot for the option for 520 byte sectors, especially toward the end there. On top of that, 512 bytes is also too small in 2022. Almost all hard drives of the last 5 years use 4 kilobyte sectors. That is 4096 bytes, or 4 times 512. Here is a SanDisk 2 terabyte flash drive from 2017. This is enterprise grade. Guess what? 520 byte sectors on this. It's built for the enterprise. Now, it's a dying breed. Anyway, back to 2022. almost all hardware RAID cards today, if you have a 512 byte or a 4K sector, they don't do any parity checking unless the drive itself reports an error. It is almost unicorn territory to find a hardware RAID controller that will use parity information without one of the drives speaking up and saying, hey, I've got a problem. Well, enter RAID 6, 2 parity drives. So with 2 parity drives, you are storing parity information in 2 places. It's kind of like the separate checksum information in a large sector, and it's also computationally less expensive. So you can figure out who is lying as long as only one drive is lying. Of course, the downside with RAID 6 is that it takes another extra drive of redundancy. If I have 5 drives with RAID 5, I have 4 drives worth of RAID capacity. If I have RAID 6, I only have 3 drives worth of capacity. What about the G-RAID SR1000? Well, it turns out with RAID 6, it doesn't check the parity either, unless the drive reports a problem. Of course, neither does Linux MD RAID, or at least it didn't initially, and no one has updated the man page, so I think it still doesn't. How did I test all this? Well, I introduced some minimal corruption. In the case of our SanDisk 2TB flash drives from 1273 AD, I updated the data, but I did not update the checksum. The LSI hardware RAID controller immediately flagged it and said that there's an inconsistency. It took a while to do the I/O, but it fetched the parity and reconstructed the data because it knew that the block that I messed with was messed up, because I took care to mess with the data block. I injected Gandalf.txt into one of the drives in the RAID 5. So it looks to me like the G-RAID is only checking parity when the drive itself actually reports an error. And the drive itself doesn't report an error if it doesn't think there's an error. So if me injecting an error doesn't actually cause an error the way that it did with our SanDisk 520 byte sector drive. So what does that mean in the real world? That means that there is nothing going on with this RAID controller to check and verify that the data that you gave it is actually the data it's giving back to you. G-RAID never complained or noticed the inconsistency. Didn't matter if I used RAID 5 or RAID 6. Now RAID 5, like I say, could maybe be forgiven for the reasons I explained, but RAID 6, I mean, I guess. I remember I mentioned on the G-RAID website, they seem to be making fun of the whole RAID 5 battery. Well, with modern controllers, it's not a battery, it's a supercapacitor, but okay, that's fine. What is happening there on the hardware RAID controller in that server over there is that it's keeping a journal in memory of all the stuff it was doing, all the writes and everything else. So if it loses power or crashes, the little battery or the supercapacitor will keep track of that. It's a journal, basically, of everything it was doing for the last few seconds. When it comes back on, it doesn't immediately clear the RAM. It checks the RAM and checks the last few things it was doing. And then it checks all the drives to see how far they made it. If there's an unclean shutdown, the RAID controller can look at what was being written, since we still have the data in the RAM, because it's preserved, and it will check and make sure that it's perfectly consistent. That closes the RAID 5 write hole. Now Linux MD, software RAID on Linux doesn't by default store a write log like that. It can on a non-volatile device, but nobody ever does that. So it has something else called the partial parity log. And so it writes out to the partial parity log what it's about to do, and then it does it with all the drives, and then it writes to the partial parity log that it finished it. And that slows things down because, well, it's got to do all that extra writing. And then even after an unclean shutdown, it still fully rechecks everything. The G-RAID card, well, it will only do a full rescan or consistency check after a crash or power loss. It doesn't have anything like the partial parity write log or anything like that that I can find. And so the performance is better because it doesn't do any extra writing. The battery, the card with the battery, the supercapacitor, it doesn't have to do a rescan or anything. I mean, it does support consistency checks to be sure, but it is able to make sure that it's consistent, so you save there. Sometimes RAID cards call that scan a patrol read or consistency scan. On Linux MD, you can schedule a rescan so that it'll scan all the drives and make sure everything's perfectly consistent with the parity and issue any corrections. Oh, and Linux MD, again, does another really boneheaded thing here. If there's an error in the parity, but no drives are reporting an error, it will rewrite the parity, even if the data was incorrect. Well, that seems boneheaded and wrong to me. Oh, speaking of that, that's exactly what the G-RAID card does too. It assumes that if it's in a RAID 6 configuration and it encounters one piece of information that's wrong, it will rewrite the parity, not affecting the data, even if the data had a problem. What a mess. That's, you know, it sounds like it's mostly directed at G-RAID, but in reality, it's just modern RAID. And this is why modern RAID is basically dead. It's because this is a mess, and as a system administrator, especially on enterprise gear, you don't want to deal with this. you're going to have the extra write overhead and you want to maximize performance, you need a technology that combines the ideas of RAID with the particular complexities of a file system. The file system itself should be the thing that understands that it's working with multiple physical drives, multiple NVMe drives, multiple whatever. And it's probably a good idea to have the file system abstract away the storage instead of a RAID card. Deal with it at a system level. The file system can journal writes, as they often do anyway, but also the journaling can be hardened against things like the RAID 5 write hole. The system can see that it's working with multiple different devices, multiple different block storage. ZFS and RAID Z does exactly that, and ZFS does it well. To a lesser extent, so does BTRFS. Both ZFS RAID Z and BTRFS absolutely positively do an integrity check on reads, and it will give you an I/O error if it's about to give you a file that has a different checksum than what it was when it was originally stored, which is great. Make sure that bit rot doesn't happen. I created the exact same testing scenario that I used here. RAID Z caught it, passed with flying colors, that actually corrected the error, issued a thing to the system log, and said, hey, here's your file. It's exactly what you gave me. Instead of needing 520 byte sectors though, the checksum and the location of the parity data is built right into the file system that helps minimize the amount of extra IOs. Unlike almost all RAID controllers, this setup also works for RAID 1, or mirroring. Sometimes it's called ZFS mirroring, but it's mirroring basically. BTRFS works pretty much the same way, although RAID 5 and RAID 6 code with BTRFS is not quite as hardened. But BTRFS also has some other innovative ideas which are sort of new and fun. If you have 5 drives and you want to use a file that is mirrored across all 5 drives, you can create and set a policy for that at the file level, and that's exactly what happens. If the checksum of one file doesn't match, it's got 4 more mirrors. It's a good argument for system administrators making decisions about redundancy at the entire volume level. What I mean by that is instead of taking a bunch of NVMe drives and deciding we're going to have 1 drive's worth of redundancy across the entire storage pool that's made up of all of these, you can just say, this folder should be mirrored across all 5 devices. This folder doesn't need any redundancy. This folder needs RAID 5 levels of redundancy. This folder needs RAID 6 levels of redundancies where it will tolerate 1 or 2 failures. You can even do RAID 10. You can say, I need this to be as fast as possible. And you don't really have to pre-allocate the entire storage device for a particular level of redundancy. You can set it as a policy at a file level or a folder level, whatever makes sense. And this is a new modern good idea, and even ZFS doesn't do this yet. I definitely think storage that lets you create a policy and BTRFS also has some other innovative ideas, or mirroring. Sometimes it's called ZFS mirroring, but it's mirroring basically. BTRFS works pretty much the same way, although RAID 5 and RAID 6 code with BTRFS is not quite as hardened. But BTRFS also has some other innovative ideas which are sort of new and fun. If you have 5 drives and you want to use a file that is mirrored across all 5 drives, you can create and set a policy for that at the file level, and that's exactly what happens. If the checksum of one file doesn't match, it's got 4 more mirrors. It's a good argument for system administrators making decisions about redundancy at the entire volume level. What I mean by that is instead of taking a bunch of NVMe drives and deciding we're going to have 1 drive's worth of redundancy across the entire storage pool that's made up of all of these, you can just say, this folder should be mirrored across all 5 devices. Hardware RAID is dead. Okay, you might not have gotten the memo about that, so you should for sure check out my other video if you didn't see that. Today's more about, okay, if it isn't dead, it's certainly got to be on life support, right? And saying its final goodbyes. But more answering the question, what fills the void that's left behind? I'm not dead yet. I don't want to go on the cart. I'm getting better. I think I'll go for a walk. I was surprised how many of you wanted to convince me that hardware RAID wasn't dead, even when dealing with our Kioxia CM7. You realize that these NVMe SSDs can do like 12, 14 gigabytes per second individually? They're PCIe Gen 5. Let me walk you through my reasoning step by step, because clearly, I can tell you it's not planning for the fjords. Not only is it dead, for the common arguments for why it shouldn't be dead, a single CM7 will take a lot of the wind out of your reasoning. But what about the latency? And it's all about the IOPS. 2.7 million IOPS for a single drive, and this is NAND flash. It's nothing special. Okay, it is special because Kioxia, but you know what I mean. think a lot of you are more worried about how to fill the void if it is dead than what to do if it is dead. So let me take the worry about that out of the equation. There's actually several ways of filling that void that can be approached today with what's available today, and we'll talk about that too. Sometimes a piece of software or an application is already designed to deal with an array of block devices directly. You don't really need a RAID volume that's less overhead than a RAID card would be anyway. So it's kind of a combination of hardware and software maybe that could make more sense for some of these. I mean, Microsoft's working on their ReFS file system, which like ZFS wants to work directly with block devices and not via a RAID controller. But before we get to that, let's talk about why it's tough to get block device performance matching even one or two of our Kioxia CM7 from a hardware RAID card. The answer really is hardware RAID technology is evolving. In a short time frame, we've gone from a server CPU having 16 or 28 or 32 PCIe lanes to 128 PCIe lanes. That's pretty much across the board, whether you're Team Red or Team Blue. 128 PCIe Gen 5 lanes. Now we've got 8 of these Kioxia CM7 PCIe Gen 5 using a U.2 form factor, but they are available in E.1 or E1.S and E3.S and U.3, other form factors as you need them. And like I said, this Gen 5 SSD is capable of up to 14 gigabytes per second, 2.7 million IOPS. That's nearly saturating the bandwidth of 4 Gen 5 lanes. I mean, look at our Crystal Disk Mark performance here. This is just baseline to give you an idea. For the hardware RAID is dead video, a few of you conceded that yes, a hardware RAID controller will be a bottleneck for this top line throughput number. But you say it's not about the throughput, it's about the IOPS. Well, even one of these drives is gonna, okay, we'll take a look at that. There might be something to that, not really, but we'll take a look. Just remember that one of these Kioxia drives moves as much information as a Gen 3 video card. Yeah, 16 Gen 3 lanes, same as 4 Gen 5 lanes. That's not to say that the random I/O, low Q depth performance is not important. Actually, that is probably one of the most important things. I mean, you are right. And a RAID card with a large cache will improve those low Q depth I/O operations without letting some of these high-speed devices get bogged down with a lot of small requests. And if you think about it, like, you know, you have a server hosting a bunch of virtual machines, whether they're hosting virtual machines for workstations or a database server or whatever, generally you're not running at 12 gigabytes per second, you know, flat plank all the time. You just need a few hundred megabytes here and there from random I/O, from tasks running in the background. So the reasoning is sound that a RAID card bottlenecking the top line performance, and it's really more about the I/O operations per second, is sound, but it'll all fall apart under scrutiny. Really, when we're talking about IOPS, we're talking about latency. And there is a relationship between the latency floor, the fastest time that you can get a request in and out, and the overall throughput for that. I mean, latency effectively is lowered by the RAM on a RAID card when you can serve the data from the RAM cache on the card. The RAM on the card is going to be faster even than our CM7. That makes sense. But most of the time you're going to be a cache miss, and that causes latency stacking. You get the latency of the cache miss plus the latency of the RAID card asking our CM7 for the block anyway. So generally it'll be worse. I mean, it's worse except when you get a cache hit, but most of the time you're not going to get a cache hit. And in fact, NVMe is so fast that a lot of modern RAID controllers don't even cache reads. They just cache writes, and it does help with writes, but one thing at a time. So it turns out that these NVMe devices are so fast, they're driving changes in how the operating system handles block and I/O devices. Yeah, turns out. Back in the day, when you would have a block device like this, it would use interrupts to notify the CPU. The CPU would say, here's a block of data, you need to do something. And then the block device would do something with that and then send a software interrupt to the CPU to say, hey, I'm done with that, give me the next thing. But these modern drives are so fast and they complete those kinds of operations so quickly that it's actually usually more efficient and faster to poll the drive rather than using interrupts. If you've been a system administrator for a long time, that sounds heretical, but this is the reality that we find ourselves in. CPU cores are so fast, and the bus is so fast, and the drives are so fast, that the overhead of servicing that interrupt is considerably higher than just polling the drive. And that's what the Linux kernel does by default now on most NVMe devices. These Gen 5 devices are so fast that putting the RAID card in the way, it hurts latency even before we get to thinking about the benchmarks. That's another way I could explain this. Whenever we are trying to characterize the performance of storage, we're concerned primarily with two things. The throughput, that top line number in crystal disk mark, how fast is the darn thing, and latency. And we talk about latency a couple of different ways. Sometimes we say it's low queue depth, sometimes we say it's queue depth 1 performance, but really these are different ways of describing latency. How fast does it take to get a single block? I'm going to ask the device for a single block of data. How fast can I get that single block of data back? Because real world random IO, a lot of the things that are happening on servers or workstations, less so on servers, more so on workstations, has to do with these low queue depth operations. You need to get a block from disk before you know which blocks you need next. So, by way of explainer, think of me, I'm your block device. I'm going to fetch blocks for you. This is probably the easiest way I can help you build a mental model of this if it's not clear. So it turns out that in our mental model, if you think of me, I can complete a request to read a block in superluminal time. It takes me 0 time. You think of a block and I give you the block instantaneously. I get a rest for a second after I give you the block, but to make this exercise simpler, it's just instantaneous. So you ask me for a block of data, instantaneously I give you a block of data. But before you ask me for the next block of data, I get a rest for 1 second. I'll also say that I can carry up to 100 blocks at a time. So if you know in advance which 100 blocks you're going to need, I can bring you all 100 blocks instantaneously and rest. But if you don't know which 100 blocks you need ahead of time, then you're going to have to wait 1 second in between each request. So you come with your first block and it's like, well, I don't really know which blocks I'm going to need, but the blocks that I'm going to need are contained in the data of block 1. So go ahead and get me block 1. So I bring you block 1 instantaneously. There's block 1. You look in it and you say, oh, now I need block 2. Well, I have to wait 1 second before I read block 2. I give you block 2, and then inside block 2 it says, you're going to need block 3. So, okay. So I go and I get block 3, and I give it to you instantaneously, and then it's like immediately you say, oh, I need block 4. So how long is it going to take me to give you 100 blocks? It's going to take 100 seconds. But if you knew ahead of time exactly which blocks you needed, you could give me the full list of 100 and I could deliver them instantaneously. This is the relationship between latency and throughput. If you can keep me fully loaded, like I can carry 100 things at a time, if you can tell me which 100 things you need, then I can bring those to you instantaneously 100 at a time. But if you can't keep me fully loaded, if you don't know ahead of time which blocks you're going to need, I can only bring you 1 at a time. That round trip latency, making you wait 1 second between requests, that's going to kill our throughput. It's 1/100th as much, potentially. Now suppose we're in queue depth 1 request mode, and the first block you asked me for is 1, and the next one really was 2, and the next one is 3. I can look at this list of blocks, after we're 3 or 4 seconds into this and say, I'm not doing anything anyway. I'm just going to go ahead and bring blocks, number 2 through 100. And all of a sudden you come back to me and you say, hey, can you bring me block 3? I wasn't clairvoyant. I didn't know that you needed block 3. I just looked down and said, okay, you asked for 1 and 2. I'm not doing anything anyway. I'm going to go ahead and bring blocks 3 through 100 because I can carry up to 100 at a time. And yeah, that worked out for us. That was instantaneously, dramatically way faster. This is more common of a thing that's happening underneath in individual NVMe devices than people realize. In the olden days, that was something your RAID controller would do for you. And it still is, to an extent. A RAID controller can figure out the access pattern. It can go ahead and algorithmically guess and pre-fetch whatever blocks it thinks are going to be needed, but it's not a given necessarily. There's a lot more of that kind of thing happening under the hood with modern storage devices than most people realize. And sometimes it's even happening at an operating system layer. The operating system's looking at it and saying, let's just go ahead and queue up all these requests. So the other thing to look at in benchmarks is how many queues do you need to fill to get to our 2.7 million requests. certainly less than 32 parallel requests at once. And sometimes there's a mathematical relationship between our QDEP1 latency and the maximum number of I/O operations per second. Sometimes our max IOPS is lower than expected, and that's usually a situation where the processor on the storage medium, like the processor inside the NVMe, is slower than can keep up with our QDEP1 performance, because real world is not actually QDEP1. I mean, even in a completely fair coin toss, you're going to get, 6 heads in a row tossing between heads and tails. That's a thing that happens even in purely random situations. And real world, with server workloads with thousands of clients, it's not truly random. Usually it looks random, but it's really not, and there's little things you can do to predict the load. So anyway, let's look at performance of our hypothetical NVMe RAID controller to see that, we're just doing napkin math here, and the napkin math is not going to work out for us. We got 4 of them, just 4. I want to run 40 gigabytes per second of throughput. That's taking out some serious overhead. And I want my low QDEP performance overall to basically be the same, because it shouldn't get any worse, right? So 16 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe just isn't enough to keep up with 4 drives times 4 lanes of Gen 5 storage. Some of you already conceded that on my Hardware Raid is Dead video. It's like, okay, but what about IOPS? Because the low latency and the performance and the caching, those things can make up the difference, right? That'll create the overall better real world performance in the way that, a very low latency storage block device like Intel Optane will have a better QDEP1 experience, and so it'll feel faster than even the highest end NAND flash-based device. Because the latency floor of an Optane type device, which is a different physical memory medium than NAND flash, it's like half what NAND flash is. So those low QDEP performance numbers are always going to be really good, even though that top line number for raw throughput is not as good on Optane as it is on modern NAND flash devices. And so you might think caching is a solution. Well, your CM7 can do 10 gigabytes per second in its sleep per drive. 32 gigabytes of cache wouldn't be an unreasonable start on a hardware RAID controller, but a lot of these highest end RAID controllers you can get, like from Broadcom, well, there are only 8 gigabytes of RAM, and that's it. And most of the time, algorithmically, that RAM is not used for read caching, because the reads are so fast anyway. It's to speed up writes. The Mega RAID 9670 is one of the highest end controllers you can get, and it does have its place. I'll admit, there are places where it can work, but you've only got 24 Gen 4 lanes to work with, and it's 16 Gen 4 lanes to the host. When I talked about this 8 gigabytes as a write buffer, that's going to give us, a second or two of low latency battery protected memory, which can improve random write performance. That is true. A lot of the time, the cache machinery makes the latency worse. So these controllers don't bother with read caching, because putting something into the cache memory and then cache missing most of the time, unless the cache is absurdly huge, is more latency than just asking the CM7 to begin with. So more often than not, these RAID controllers simply will not cache reads, because the drives are already fast enough in terms of reads, and the cache size on the card is just not large enough. Wait, what? Yeah, it's clear from some of the comments that a fair number of you don't understand that. And when we're talking about enterprise solutions, like truly enterprise solutions where you've got racks and racks and racks of stuff, they are a lot of the time using system memory as a read cache, not the cache on the RAID controller. The cache on the RAID controller